Good morning, everyone. The committee will come to order, and pursuant to notice, the Committee on Science and Technology meets to consider the following measures: H.R. 3650, the Harmful Algae Blooms and Hypoxia Research and Control Amendments Act of 2009, H.R. 3585, the Solar Technology Roadmap Act, and H.R. 3598, the Energy Water Research Integration Act. First, we will consider a bill by the Subcommittee Chairman Dr. Baird, and co-authored by Research and Science Education Ranking Member Dr. Ehlers. H.R. 3650, the Harmful Algae Blooms and Hypoxia Research and Control Amendments Act of 2009, seeks to address the devastating effects that the rapid overproduction of algae can have on aquatic plant and animal life and human health. The bill directs the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration to implement research strategies to better understand and respond to algae blooms and hypoxic events. Next, we will consider H.R. 3585, the Solar Technology Roadmap Act, authored by the Space and Aeronautics Subcommittee Chair, Mrs. Gabrielle Giffords. This bill instructs the Department of Energy to coordinate with public and private sector entities in developing a comprehensive, updated roadmap for solar research, development, and demonstration activities in the U.S. This roadmap would be a critical tool in utilizing limited research dollars as effectively as possible to harness the truly immense solar resources we have in the U.S. Finally, we will take up H.R. 3598, the Energy Water Research Integration Act. In the last Congress, this committee undertook a comprehensive review of federal research and technology development efforts, focusing in on improving utilization of our precious water resources. We have since held 5 hearings and passed out of the House 3 bills pertaining to this important topic. H.R. 3598, in which we will address the critical linkage between our nation's energy and water resources by directing the Department of Energy to better integrate water into existing federal energy research efforts. The 3 bills we have before us today target several important research needs, and as always, we appreciate the minority offering a number of valuable ideas and suggestions, and we have worked hard to incorporate almost all of them in an effort to improve these bipartisan bills. I now recognize Mr. Hall to present his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And today, as you've pointed out, we're marking up H.R. 3650, the Harmful Algal Bloom and Hypoxia Research and Control Amendments Act of 2009, H.R. 3585, the Solar Technology Roadmap Act, and H.R. 3598, the Energy and Water Research Integration Act. And I'd like to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank your staff for working with us, working with the minority. Worked with us on these bills, and you helped us address as much as possible our concerns. Unfortunately, we were not able to come to agreement on all of our concerns, but I realize that that can't always be the case. I'll elaborate on these when the bills are brought up for amendment. We'll have amendments that address those areas of the bills that we feel that still need some attention, in particular the solar and the energy and water bill. I do hope that the chairman and other members of this committee will give our amendments thoughtful consideration, as we feel they are intended to improve the bills and enhance support for them. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Members may place statements in the record at this point. We will now consider H.R. 3650, the Harmful Algae Blooms and Hypoxia Research Control Amendments Act of 2009. I recognize the chairman of the Energy and Environmental Subcommittee, Dr. Baird, to describe the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 3650, as amended last week in the Energy and Environment Subcommittee markup, establishes a national harmful algal bloom and hypoxia program. This program is charged with developing a comprehensive national strategy and coordinating regional research and action plans to address marine and freshwater harmful algal blooms and hypoxia. The Act requires the Undersecretary to work cooperatively with other offices, centers, and programs within NOAA, as well as with states, tribes, non-governmental organizations, and other federal agencies on the task force, and it requires that they avoid duplication of efforts with other entities. In addition, the Undersecretary is directed to build upon existing research and assessments and consider U.S. waterways such as the Chesapeake Bay in the development of the plans. The EPA Administrator and the NOAA Undersecretary are instructed to coordinate their efforts to address the freshwater harmful algal blooms and hypoxia. The bill directs the Mississippi River Gulf of Mexico Watershed Nutrient Task Force to transmit a report to Congress on progress made towards attaining the goals of the 2008 Gulf Hypoxia Action Plan. H.R. 3650 directs the Interagency Task Force to transmit an assessment report and plan to Congress addressing hypoxia in the coastal and estuarine waters of the Pacific Northwest. Finally, the bill provides an authorization of $35 million a year to the Undersecretary for 5 years for the program and $6 million a year to the EPA Administrator for the freshwater HABs activities of the program. I want to thank particularly my colleague from Michigan, Dr. Ehlers, for his work this year and over many, many years leading the effort on harmful algal blooms and hypoxia. I also want to acknowledge the involvement of Congressman Connie Mack and of Ms. Costas, also from Florida. This is a bipartisan bill. It's been a privilege to work on it. As one context, Mr. Chairman, the week we were working on this bill, a lake in my district, someone went there with their dog, threw their favorite tennis ball in the water. Dog jumped in, grabbed the tennis ball, got out of the water, and died. That's how serious these harmful algal blooms can be. They are deadly toxins, not only in shellfish but in fresh water, and it was literally that quick. Came out and died. Appreciate the committee's consideration, urge passage, and yield back.
I now recognize Mr. Hall to present any remarks on the bill.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to commend my colleagues, Dr. Ehlers and Dr. Baird, for working together to move this bill. They worked very well together, and I think it's a very important piece of legislation, so much so that the bill itself and the manager's amendments are both at both subcommittee and now at the full committee, have been very bipartisan. With most of the issues have been worked out beforehand, there's still a few outstanding items. Although this bill is intended to address a problem that affects nearly every state, we want to make sure that the regional research and action plans that are called for, that these plans are not a top-down mandate, but a true collaboration between the federal government and the states and local areas that have been directly affected by these blooms. The bill calls for the development and implementation of these plans. The next obvious step is putting these plans into action. We want to make sure that they're not imposing undue burdens on states that they would not voluntarily take on themselves. Finally, we want to make sure that all the groups involved in the development of these plans that will have roles in future implementation are ones with the highest level of integrity. I'll be offering an amendment to this bill that addresses our concerns with states' rights. Several of my colleagues on this side of the aisle will be offering other amendments that address some of the remaining concerns. With that, I yield back my time, and I thank you.
Does anyone else wish to be recognized?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Bilbrey.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate this issue. I notice in the title and everything else that the issue of harmful algae bloom was specifically, and I would ask Dr. Baird specifically that does this bill recognize that most, if not much of algae blooms are naturally occurring events?
It does. It varies. I mean, part of the purpose of the research is to understand why we have harmful algal blooms and why we have. There's no question that harmful algal blooms have been around for a long, long time. But there is the scientists who testified at our hearing and the preponderance of the scientific literature I'm familiar with suggests that there is an increase in many areas in harmful algal blooms believed to be related to anthropogenic causes.
I think there's the key, is that there's certain areas. We've got documentation in California since 1769. The first Spanish recognized this. In fact, the local tribes, specifically like the Lusano or the Kumeyaay, would not stay on the coast during the summers when red tides came in. They actually migrated into the hills and basically lived in the hills away from that. So the fact of red tide, at least in California, the area I'm very much aware of, working on water qualities, and naturally occurring, has been going on for centuries, and actually is something that I want to make sure that we identify as being naturally occurring, even though it does cause problems. That is why you'll see at least in the West, in my part of the world, and I assume your part of the world, that shellfish collection has never been allowed during the summer because of this. And even the Native Americans recognized that and summered in the hills just because they didn't want to pick up the abalone during the summer.
If the gentleman would yield for a
Yes.
point's very well taken. The bill is not by any means solely or predominantly about identifying what is or is not anthropogenically caused. Part of the challenge, part of the progress of the bill over the last few years has been, for example, better predicting when naturally occurring harmful algal blooms will occur, so you can better warn beachgoers, government regulatory agencies that deal with clam seasons, et cetera. And we've got some real progress on both coasts where research funded under prior iterations of this bill has allowed us to make better predictions of when harmful algal blooms that are presumably, in these cases, many times naturally occurring. So the gentleman's point is well taken.
Mr. Chairman, my biggest concern is the years that I served working on water quality issues. The frustration was Washington designed a system based on the experience in the Chesapeake and the eastern seaboard, and its application in the Pacific was just absolutely off bounds. And the Clean Water Act still has problems because it was engineered for the East Coast, which is logical in Chesapeake, would be absurd in the deep Pacific Ocean. And so that is, I just want to make sure that we keep on that the nation is a global approach on a lot of this, but the fact is that when we go to these regulations, we've got to give the local flexibility to reflect the environment in the neighborhood rather than just here in D.C., and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Bilbrey. I'm sure that Dr. Baird, being a West Coaster, will keep that in mind. And Dr. Ehlers, the co-sponsor of the bill, is recognized.
Well, just wanted to comment on one of the issues raised about whether this is increasing or not. It is increasing. In the Gulf Coast area, for example, it's considerably worse than it was some years ago. But also it's unique in the sense that we are now beginning to discover the same problem in the Great Lakes, particularly Lake Erie. And that's a matter of huge concern because they've not seen these sorts of things before in the Great Lakes system. They're now beginning to see them. So it's whereas it used to be a local problem along the east and west coast and the Gulf Coast, it's now becoming a problem throughout the entire nation.
Would the gentleman yield for 1 second?
I'd be happy to yield.
The gentleman's absolutely right. And just for those of my colleagues who weren't on the subcommittee, just to get a sense of how, particularly the freshwater toxins, we're familiar with red tide. The freshwater toxins, if they were to invade your primary reservoir of blue-green algae, all the normal ways we have of purifying our water, virtually all, don't work. So we're used to killing protozoa with chlorine. We're used to filtering things out with filtration. We're used to saying you can boil your water. Turns out that if you boil water with blue-green algae in it, you actually concentrate the toxin that is in them, and the scientists actually boil the water. That way, that's how they sort out the toxin. So if you get blue-green algae in your freshwater drinking water supply, you're in enormous trouble, and that's why it's been such a concern to Dr. Ehlers and the Great Lakes. Thank you. You'll bet.
Hope no terrorist is hearing that. We better be quiet here. Does anyone else wish to be recognized? If not, I ask unanimous consent that the bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any point, and that the members proceed with amendments in the order of the roster. Without objection, so ordered. The first amendment on the roster is a manager's amendment offered by the gentleman from Washington, Dr. Baird. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Indeed, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3650, amendment number 038, offered by Mr. Baird of Washington and Mr. Ehlers of Michigan.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
The manager's amendment responds to concerns expressed by NOAA, EPA, and other expert witnesses at the hearing and makes several clarifying changes. The amendment strengthens and expands in Section 4 to provide more direction to the administrator of EPA in addressing freshwater harmful algal blooms. The amendment also clarifies language for the new infrastructure program to be established by the Undersecretary. Finally, the amendment makes small adjustments to the authorization section to provide specific direction for funding certain internal research efforts of NOAA. The amendment is the product, again, of discussions with Dr. Ehlers and minority staff, strengthens the bill to ensure an effective approach to both marine and freshwater harmful algal blooms. I urge my colleagues to support it and yield back.
Is there further discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Hall is recognized.
I thank you, and I'd like to applaud Dr. Ehlers and Dr. Baird for working together so well on this management amendment. They direct opposites in some ways, and yet they're so parallel in many ways, and they really work well together. it provides a lot greater direction in the agencies of the task force on what are the most important issues they should focus on. Although I'm not in favor of overly burdensome directives, too much directives allows agencies sometimes to misinterpret the intent of Congress. This amendment walks that very fine line. It balances between too much and not enough. I think Dr. Ehlers might have said too much and Dr. Baird not enough, or maybe just the opposite way, but it's a good amendment, and I encourage my associates to support it. I yield back.
Sounds like the baby bear's porridge there. Is there further discussion on the amendment? If no, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The second amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by my friend, the ranking member, Mr. Hall. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 015, offered by Mr. Hall of Texas.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment would prevent H.R. 3650 from forcing state, tribal, or local governments to shoulder the economic burdens through the requirements of the federal government. H.R. 3650 aims to ensure dialogue with state, tribal, and local governments. However, this bill calls for the development of regional research and action plans that will then need to be implemented. This implementation could lead to an unintended financial burden on these government entities. And although the onus is currently on the federal government, the activities identified in these plans are ones that will most likely be executed by state, tribal, and local governments. As it's written right now, H.R. 3650 does not contain any safeguards against unfunded mandates, which would result if the state, tribal, and local governments were forced to undertake the activities identified in the plans that the federal government is responsible for developing and implementing. That's my problem, and I yield back.
Is there further discussion on the amendment? Ms. Johnson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. On yesterday, my subcommittee had a hearing on this very thing, and we've had hearings on most of the large bodies of water in the country. All of them are contaminated. We do not have the money to correct all of it, but what we're attempting to do is get all the stakeholders around, like the Chesapeake and other large bodies of water, and each of them takes some responsibility for keeping it clean. It seems to me that this would interfere with that, but we know that we cannot clean up the Chesapeake without the participation of Pennsylvania and New York and all the other places that it touches. And it's the same with the Sound in New York. And we talked about trying to develop regional plans where these large bodies of water exist, because the government is not going to be able to do all of it by itself. So we're asking local governments to be stakeholders in it. This might interfere with that, but it's because of the contamination we're experiencing. We talked directly on this water lily thing and how it is causing a number of seafood deaths because it produces a lot of nitrogen. For that reason, I have some question on whether this would interfere with regional plans. You know, we've got states all over the country fussing with each other about water, but somehow we've got to pull all that together and get various states to work together, and we thought it might be better if it was regionally organized so that Mr. Bilbray won't be talking about what the Northeast Coast is doing. He'll be talking about what the West Coast is doing.
The gentlelady yield.
Yes.
I agree that the coordination needs to be done. I don't think anyone here would assume that those of us from Texas or California care more about Long Island Sound than the people that live in New York and New Jersey. Mm-hmm. So I think that this is one of those issues of saying Washington wants to work with the local communities, but let's not take the position of we know better, we care more, we have more of a vested interest. And
We are speaking to every official that has anything to do with water in each of these states.
And I think that the amendment basically says is that we will do our part and we will pay for what we think ought to be done right, but we won't basically be imposing a cost on the states or the local community that basically are the ones who have the biggest vested interest. So we work with them and not on top of them. And so I appreciate that. But again, I just say that I think the people in the local communities, we ought to give them more credit that they have more at stake than we do, and work with them and not the mandate.
Reclaiming my
Thank you.
time. I agree with you. That's why we are working with them. We've had round tables where we just sit around the table and talk about it. For example, Connecticut and New York are taking the full load right now of that contamination, but we know that New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts also have a lot of downflow that provides a lot of the contamination. And if the states' representatives themselves agree to work together to clean it up, I would like not to interfere with that. Thank you.
Does anyone else wish to be recognized? Mr. Brown.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield to Mr. Hall.
I thank you, Dr. Brown. You know, local governments have fought unfunded mandates against state governments, and state governments have fought unfunded mandates against the national government. Here, we're trying to protect the local governments and the state governments, and my amendment wouldn't prevent stakeholders from pitching in. However, the concern is a top-down mandate that serves or force states to take on too much. Seems like it's a states' rights deal or even a local government's amendment. I can't answer any better than unfunded mandates that we've all fought at one time or another, whether we were taking the local government's position. I've been a state county judge, I've been a state senator, and I'm a federal congressman here, and I've fought unfunded mandates all the way up and down the row there. This is just another protection for stakeholders. It's another protection for local governments and another protection for states. It looks like it's okay to me, but I recognize and I respect the wishes of others and the complaints of others, and I'm willing to let the committee vote on it.
Reclaiming my time, I support this amendment. I think it's a common sense amendment. Many states, like my own state of Georgia, is having difficulty balancing our budget. We have a balanced budget amendment to our Constitution in the state of Georgia, and what we see is teacher salaries are being cut, services are being cut. I was up in the mountains and I just talked to some of the Department of Natural Resources folks, and they've had some of their biologists cut. And adding more unfunded mandates upon the states is going to put more of a financial burden upon those states. We in Georgia can't afford any more unfunded mandates from Washington, D.C., and I'll continue to try to fight to get those unfunded mandate burdens off of my state, and as well as every state in this country. I think it's unfair to the state, it's unfair to the taxpayers, and this is a common sense amendment. It just says the federal government's going to do their part. The states certainly have the prerogative, and they have the interest, and they have all the if you'll give me a half second, I'll be glad to yield. They have every incentive to try to look at these problems. But putting unfunded mandates from Washington, D.C. on the states is unfair to the taxpayers of those states. It's unfair to the communities it affected. And so I think it's important for us to stop these unfunded mandates on the states from Washington, D.C., and I'll yield.
Thank you, sir. As you know, your state, Tennessee, and Florida have been fighting for the last probably 10 years over water, and we cannot get them together. We had to pass some legislation to force them to work with each other. I should think that everyone ought to be willing to help to clean up the water that they drink, and this is a protection against allowing it to get to that point. Cleaning up before it gets to that point is much better than trying to clean up afterwards, which is what we're trying to do all over the country now. So if this does not affect the planning and the agreement between these areas, I don't know if we're going to get your state together because they've been fussing too long. But we're trying. Thank you, and I'll yield back your time.
Well, I appreciate the lady's comments, but as far as I'm concerned, the water that falls on Georgia is Georgia's until it goes to Alabama, Tennessee, or to Florida. But the thing is, we've got to protect the citizens of our states, and the states cannot afford any more unfunded mandates. So this is a common sense amendment, and I highly support it. Now, yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Would gentlemen yield before we yield back?
Certainly.
They ought to mention California in those fighting battles between North and Southern California. If North and Southern California ever got together, they could pass almost anything they wanted to here. So it's to our benefit that they continue to fight over those water outside in California. Right?
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman.
I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
5 minutes to Dr. Baird, to, among other things, to clarify whether Georgia can put a pipe in the Tennessee River by virtue of this bill.
I choose not to go there, Mr. Chairman. I understand the gentleman's intent, and I have great respect for the ranking member. The challenge is, the research we've heard is, I mean, these are rivers, and so rivers feed into estuaries, feed into the large waterways. The dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico is now hundreds of kilometers. Anything that swims into it or out of it, you go into it, you die. So it's having a profound impact on the fisheries there. The coast of Florida, when they get red tides, their beaches are shut down, their tourism industry gets killed. So you have an unfunded mandate imposed on those states by the upriver states whose effluent is contributing to the harmful algal blooms and the hypoxia. And the problem is, if you don't have a federal government, one upriver state says, well, nuts to the guys downriver. We're just going to, let whatever runs in there run in there. We're just not going to add the expense. And they pass on what is effectively an unfunded mandate. So it's not, it's not like a local control issue where you just got a constrained city council boundary, or you've got a river that flows on down into a body of water shared by many, many states and downriver folks. And as I read this bill, it's saying that, I would guess I've just asked the gentleman from Texas or some of my colleagues, if we have evidence that something being done upriver is causing a lethal toxin to develop downriver, don't we have a right or a responsibility to tell the upriver folks they got to do something about that?
If you're asking me, I'd rather withdraw my objection to it than to try to explain.
Well, I'll reclaim my time. I mean, that's the challenge here. I understand the intent, but that's the nature of this particular problem, and I think we just have to defeat this however well-intentioned amendment, because I think its adverse consequences will be grave, and we do have downriver impacts, and so I would urge its defeat.
On my amendment, I'm going to mark doubtful by your name.
You may do so.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield.
Thank you. This may seem strange from a physician, but isn't that what the court's for, is to try to sort out these types of things where one entity is harmed by another?
Well, if I reclaim my time,
yes, sir.
The court must operate under laws. We establish laws like the Clean Water Act that the court then interprets, unless we're going to somehow imply that there's a tort action from one state against another for the pollution. I mean, we have federal laws, and what this bill predominantly, I want to reiterate, is a research bill, but it also has, and I want to underscore something. Mr. Bilbray and others have talked about the importance of local planning and states collaboration. The reason we have task force, Mr. Bilbray, is precisely so it's not, say, a Chesapeake Bay solution provided to Sacramento or Los Angeles or Puget Sound. We've got regional entities. They're instructed to work with regional governments specifically in the bill, but at some point, if you reach a point where upriver state activities are imposing undue burdens on the downriver states, you've got to have a mechanism to say y'all have to cut that out. And that's the scientists are telling us that some of this hypoxia and harmful algal blooms seem to be connected to nitrogen and phosphorus in the water system, and we're going to have to reduce that, or we're imposing a huge unfunded mandate on the beaches that Mr. Mack represents, or that folks in the Gulf represent, or conceivably in Mr. Ehler's case in the Great Lakes. So that's why I think we have to move forward. I yield back.
Mr. Enos is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And a question for Dr. Barrett is, if the bill isn't asserting regulatory control, right? So therefore, if the Mr. Hall's amendment really doesn't go to there's no ability under the bill to mandate something in the scenario you just described of downriver, right?
Well, let me read the language of the amendment. Okay, nothing in this act or the amendments made by the Act shall construe to require a state, tribal, or local government to take any action that may result in an increased financial burden to such government. The bill does include the development of regional plans, and the bill includes regional plans to try to reduce that. My concern is that the very broad language, the absolute language of the proposed amendment would suggest that you can't require any implementation at any point down the road. You might even say if the Act is funding research and the research knowledge is pointing to a particular pollutant in a particular state, you can't use that research knowledge generated by the Act to impose some kind of a constraint on the behavior or the action, and that's the concern I have. I think it's just so broad. Somebody's going to say you can't do anything based on this, and at some point you have to say that's part of what the federal government does. Is it looks at these broad issues and tries to take action for the benefit of the overall good of all the states.
Yeah, and there's money in the bill though to pay for that research, right? So therefore, and to pay for the development of those plans. So it's either that we don't have jurisdiction over what Mr. Hall is asserting here, because we don't have regulatory control, in which case the amendment would be harmless to the bill, except for making a point about unfunded mandates. So in that way, I wonder if it's really acceptable. I mean, I know we're having this debate about unfunded mandates, but it's really a situation where we don't have jurisdiction over regulation, and there's money in the bill to pay for the expenses of the plan.
It's a very, with the gentleman, you?
Sure.
As far as the expenses of the plan, absolutely right. The money in the bill pays for that. The bill's not mandating necessarily, the bill's not mandating that the states pay for these research plans.
Right.
There would be an assumption and a hope that the states have some expertise and knowledge of, whether it's their Department of Fish and Wildlife, Fisheries, Agriculture, whatever the state entities are, that they would participate. We're trying to cooperate with the states, not mandate that they deploy all these folks. If the gentleman's point is that the lack of immediate regulatory authority in the bill obviates the amendment, then we could just withdraw the amendment. I'm okay with that. If you're saying that the amendment's superfluous because of the nature of the bill itself, I'm certainly okay with that. But I'm not okay with saying we're going to add this on here so that someone can retroactively come back and say, no, this plan grew out of this bill, and any effort to implement this plan that grew out of this bill was proscribed by this bill. I can't go with that.
If there's no further discussion,
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Rohrabacher is recognized.
Well, first of all, I want to congratulate Ms.
I guess we need to go to this side first, since that was Mr. Inglis's.
Pardon me.
But I don't see anybody here. So, Mr. Rohrabacher is.
First of all, let me congratulate Congressman Barrett. I think this is an important issue. And the reason Brian knows about this and I know about this, we surfed in the red tide a lot, and you get red skin, and it's itchy. But I might note at night when you're surfing in the red tide, there's phosphorus, and it's like a light show as you're going through the waves. But
how's your hippocampus these days?
Well, I will tell you, there are dead fish and things around as well, and so we know this is really a significant issue, and I want to be very supportive of the base of what you're trying to do, and I will be supporting the bill. However, Mr. Hall's amendment does make sense. I mean, we're just talking about unfunded mandate. I, for example, have supported we just were voting on the Chesapeake Bay bill the other day, and I joined in with some of my other colleagues on both sides of the island, supported that because you were trying to what? You're doing something in a body of water that affects different states. Now, we provided money for that. All this is saying that if there is an unfunded mandate, we should fund it if it's dealing with different states, right? I mean, this is
would the gentleman yield?
all about. Yes.
The problem with that is it allows the states to be the least common denominator. If a certain upriver state says it's for other states to clean up their pollution, we're not going to clean up our pollution unless the federal government pays us to do so.
That's my point.
Okay.
My point was that if we indeed are going to be doing something that requires some major expenditure by the states, well, we should just provide the money because, by definition, it's an interstate issue and not simply a one-state issue. And that's what the federal government is here for. The federal government is here to be involved with interstate issues that cost money, and to solve. So I don't see anything wrong with the congressman talking about unfunded mandates to the state, because that money should be coming from the federal government, just as we just did with Chesapeake Bay.
Would the gentleman yield?
Sure.
I appreciate you bringing up the red tide issue. In fact, let me just say to anybody, if you haven't sailed through a red tide on a moonless night,
It's incredible.
it's the closest thing to flying through space with fire everywhere. Wherever the boat touches, it lights up. It's quite an experience. But I think that the gentlelady from Texas and the gentleman from the doctor points out something I think that everybody has to be aware of, is there is third-party victims in this sometimes. Nobody goes down in history as more of a villain in this kind of activity than the city of Chicago. You've got Chicago River flowing into your lake, which is your water supply. You've got pollution in your water supply. So what do? You dig a canal so you can you make the Chicago River flow backwards into the Illinois, down the Mississippi, and all the way through to New Orleans, and say it's not our problem anymore. So I think there's legitimate concern about when the federal government should step in. In fact, my wife's from New Orleans, and she always talks about that she grew up in a city that the water was flushed 55 times before it got to her. And I think that Chicago is an example of where the chairman, that Dr. Baird is talking about. I only ask that we find that fault before we bring down the federal government's involvement to protect the third innocent party. What frustrates me, especially working with Clean Water Act stuff, is that the third parties never existed in certain locations, especially where Hawaii is a good example of being required to fulfill the treatment standards and being able to have regulatory oversight by the federal government over something that didn't affect anybody but their own population. So all I ask is that before we make the step in to protect a third party, that the legislature or somebody down the line has to assure that there is a third party to be defended. Because right now you've got Hawaii having regulations imposed on them that there was never an intention by the authors of the Clean Water Act to impose that in those situations. But because it wasn't specifically clarified that there needs to be a burden of proof or burden that there is a innocent third party which triggers federal intervention, it always goes the other way. You always trigger and it ends up going overall. So I think the amendment's appropriate, Dr. Baird, as long as we assure that there are going to be times that if the studies do, because this is a research bill, this research bill will probably bring up items that we do need to have the federal government intervene, but there's many places that we shouldn't. And all I ask that at this time we don't take this step. We use the data and the science here to take the next step when the facts are located. And we know where there's going to be, but they're not going to be everywhere, and that's why I think the amendment's appropriate.
Would the gentleman yield?
I have the time, and I'll be happy.
Yeah, I just want to point out that the federal government's going to do the implementation, and that implementation could lead to what we'd refer to as unintended financial burdens on the governmental entities, and that's what it's guided toward. And the reason that, as it's written right now, H.R. 3650 doesn't contain any safeguards, none, against unfunded mandates. That's the reason for the amendment, and that's the sole purpose of the amendment.
Gentleman's time has expired. If there's no further discussion,
Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Bartlett.
Thank you. I'd just like to ask a procedural question. I do not know what rules have been changed, but if the rule for this bill does not waive points of order, could not a point of order be lodged against the bill if, in fact, there are unfunded mandates exceeding $5 million collectively?
If the rules are not waived, that's correct.
Would not Mr. Hall's concern, could it not be addressed on the floor if the rule did not waive points of order? Why would we want on a bipartisan committee to have a rule that waives points of order?
Well, you have two questions there.
Yes, I would like an answer to both of them.
Well, first of all, you're correct, and secondly, it's the Rules Committee that makes that determination, not this committee.
What would the chairman recommend to the Rules Committee?
Do the right thing.
And what would the right thing be?
I think a vote will wipe out all of these concerns. If you want to go ahead and call the vote.
Well, I think Ms. Biggers wants to defend Chicago.
Absolutely. Thank you for yielding me the time. Actually, talking about going upstream or downstream, we now have a problem in Chicago and just outside of Chicago, and having had to build an electronic barrier to keep the Asian carp out of Chicago and the whole Great Lakes, and it really is a very serious problem. But we do have the Asian carp swimming upstream from downstates, and it's a real problem right now where we've had to have emergency funds because they are really approaching that electronic barrier in my district. So I think we should look at both upstream and downstream when you're considering this.
Thank you, Ms. Biggers. If there's no further discussion, the clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Gordon.
Excuse me, pardon me. The vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. No. No. The noes have it. Does the gentleman vote? The clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Gordon.
No.
Chairman Gordon votes no. Mr. Costello. Ms. Johnson. Ms. Johnson. Ms. Johnson votes no. Ms. Woolsey. Mr. Wu. Mr. Baird. Mr. Baird votes no. Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller votes no. Mr. Lipinski. Ms. Giffords. Ms. Giffords votes no. Ms. Edwards. Ms. Edwards votes no. Ms. Fudge. Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes no. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Rothman. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis votes no. Mr. Chandler. Mr. Chandler votes no. Mr. Carnahan. No. Mr. Carnahan votes no. Mr. Hill. No. Mr. Hill votes no. Mr. Wilson. No. Mr. Wilson votes no. Mrs. Dahlkemper. No. Mrs. Dahlkemper votes no. Mr. Grayson. No. Mr. Grayson votes no. Ms. Cosmas. Yes. Ms. Cosmas votes aye. Mr. Peters. No. Mr. Peters votes no. Mr. Hall.
Aye.
Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner. Mr. Lamar Smith. Mr. Roybacher.
Yes.
Mr. Roybacher votes aye. Mr. Bartlett. Aye. Mr. Bartlett votes aye. Mr. Ehlers. Aye. Mr. Ehlers votes aye. Mr. Lucas. Mrs. Biggert. Mrs. Biggert votes aye. Mr. Aiken. Mr. Aiken votes aye. Mr. Nagelbauer. Mr. Inglis. Mr. Inglis votes aye. Mr. McCall. Mr. McCall votes aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bilbray votes aye. Mr. Adrian Smith. Mr. Adrian Smith votes aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown votes aye. Mr. Olson. Mr. Wu is not recorded. Mr. Wu votes no. Mr. Costello is not recorded. Mr. Costello votes no. Mr. Rothman votes no.
Thank you.
Don't.
If no one else is available, then the clerk will report. Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm
Clerk,
sorry.
you need to.
Mr. Mitchell? Yes. Mr. Mitchell votes aye.
No, she didn't call his name. Oh, did he vote yes? Would the clerk clarify Mr. Mitchell's vote? It wasn't well heard up here.
Mr. Mitchell was recorded as voting aye.
Okay. That's fine.
You ready for the roll? Okay. Mr. Chairman, 13 members vote aye and 22 members vote no.
The amendment fails. Somewhat out of order, let me also suggest that the committee would like to pass our best on to Mr. Neugebauer, hopefully that he will be back with us soon. So if his staff is here, please convey that on behalf of the entire committee. The third amendment on the roster is the amendment offered by the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Smith. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3650, amendment number 001, offered by Mr. Smith of Nebraska.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would insert the phrase, quote, at the request of the states, unquote, in two parts of the bill. The first is where H.R. 3650 outlines the duties of Undersecretary as head of the task force and requires the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration to oversee the development and implementation, review, and periodic updating of the regional research and action plans. The second is where H.R. 3650 describes the plan details, including the fact it is the Undersecretary who is responsible for overseeing the development and implementation of the plans. Inserting this phrase would ensure the states, as part of regions affected by harmful algal blooms and hypoxia, would be involved from the ground up in ascertaining there was a problem and identifying potential solutions. The intent of H.R. 3650 is for NOAA to be responsible for the ultimate development and implementation of the plans. Although the bill requires NOAA to coordinate with state, tribal, and local officials through this process, my amendment would strengthen the concept of states maintaining primacy over their freshwater and coastal resources by requiring states initiate the process. Start with requesting the plans instead of having the plans forced upon them. It is not anticipated any state would refuse to request such a plan. Considering the widespread economic and environmental impacts blooms and hypoxia could impose, some states are already encouraging some sort of action on this issue. Compelling NOAA to wait until the states in each region request a plan would preserve state control over their freshwater and coastal resources. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. Dr.
Baird is recognized.
This amendment, the well-intentioned, raises many of the same issues we just went over, so I won't belabor those. The bill, as the gentleman mentioned, specifically instructs collaborative efforts with the states. My concern about the amendment is it would effectively give one state or another veto power, and if that state happens to be a major contributor in some fashion to the factors that exacerbate harmful algal blooms, either fresh or saltwater, they would basically have veto power over the task force, and I think that's a mistake, so I would urge its defeat.
Is there further discussion?
Mr. Chairman.
Without, okay, yes.
Mr. Rohrabacher. Request time, I yield to my colleague.
Thank you. I would just add that I would hope that this whole notion would not be the heavy hand of the federal government that comes down, and that we urge states to step up. I guess it boils down to basic philosophy, but certainly I think that this amendment would encourage states to work together, that I think will bring about a much more effective work product in resolving these issues, rather than encouraging states to pit one against another. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I yield back my time.
If there's no further discussion, The vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. No. The nays have it.
Mr. Chairman, I ask a recorded vote, please.
The clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Gordon.
No.
Chairman Gordon votes no. Mr. Costello. Mr. Costello votes no. Ms. Johnson. Ms. Johnson votes no. Ms. Woolsey. Mr. Wu. Mr. Wu votes no. Mr. Baird. Mr. Baird votes no. Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller votes no. Mr. Lipinski. Mr. Lipinski votes no. Ms. Giffords. Ms. Giffords votes no. Ms. Edwards. Ms. Edwards votes no. Ms. Fudge. Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes no. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Rothman. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis votes no. Mr. Chandler. Mr. Chandler votes no. Mr. Carnahan. Mr. Carnahan votes no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill votes no. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell votes no. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes no. Mrs. Dahlkemper. Mrs. Dahlkemper votes no. Mr. Grayson. Mr. Grayson votes no. Ms. Cosmas. Ms. Cosmas votes no. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters votes no. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner. Mr. Lamar Smith. Mr. Roybacher.
Yep.
Mr. Roybacher votes aye. Mr. Bartlett. Mr. Ehlers. Mr. Ehlers votes aye. Mr. Lucas. Mrs. Biggert. Mrs. Biggert votes aye. Mr. Aiken. Mr. Nagelbauer. Mr. Inglis. Mr. Inglis votes aye. Mr. McCall. Mr. McCall votes aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bilbray passes. Mr. Adrian Smith. Mr. Adrian Smith votes aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown votes aye. Mr. Olson.
How is Mr. Rothman recorded?
Mr. Rothman is not recorded. Mr. Rothman votes no.
And how is Mr. Aiken recorded?
Mr. Aiken is not recorded. Mr. Aiken votes aye.
Mr. Chairman.
And how is Mr. Matheson recorded?
Mr. Matheson is not recorded. Mr. Matheson votes no.
And Mr. Bilbrey, how is he recorded?
Mr. Bilbray is reported as pass.
Make that an aye, please.
Mr. Bilbray votes aye.
Is there anyone else that hasn't been recorded? Ms. Edwards, were you recorded? Okay.
I'm sorry, I didn't give you
The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, 10 members vote aye and 24 members vote no.
The amendment fails. Fourth amendment on the roster is the amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia, Dr. Brown. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Mr.
Okay,
Chairman,
pardon me,
withdraw
Mr.
my
Brown.
amendment.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Brown. The clerk will the vote is now on the bill, H.R. 3650, as amended. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion, the ayes have it. And the ayes have it. So, I now recognize myself for a motion. Staff be instructed to prepare the legislative report and make necessary technical and conforming changes, and that the chairman take all necessary steps to bring the bill before the House for consideration. The question is now on the motion to report the bill favorably. Those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The bill is favorably reported. Without objection, the motion is to consider is laid upon the table. The members will have 2 subsequent calendar days in which to submit supplemental, minority, or additional views on the measure. We now consider H.R. 3585, the Solar Technology Roadmap Act, and I recognize the chairman of this. Well, we'll recognize Mr. Hall to begin on Mr. Hall on H.R. 3585.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you, and I thank Representative Giffords for her working with us on your bill. And while we're certainly supportive of solar energy and see great potential, it has to be a contributor of energy to our constituents, we do have some concerns with the large authorization in the bill and the requirement of funds to be directed to the roadmap recommendations. First, the bill authorizes $2.25 billion over 5 years. Now, that's a lot of money, and one wonders if it would be better to provide at least some money for investment tax credits for solar energy or long-term incentives to develop renewable energy in general. And that's kind of been the thrust of the past. And there have been thrusts in the past on solar, and they're worthwhile thrusts. This is a worthwhile thrust. Second, the bill directs the Secretary to spend a minimum increasing amount with no maximum limit of the authorization on the R&D set forth by the Roadmap Committee, at least 1/3 of which Roadmap Committee is made up of industry, who are explicitly exempted from the Federal Advisory Committee Act, which is intended to provide an open and transparent process. The optics of this are that you now have a committee whose membership could be primarily industry, telling the DOE where to direct taxpayer money or R&D that could benefit their companies while not having to answer to anyone or defend their recommendations, even when they fail, and benefit by their own failure. I'm sure this is not what Ms. Giffords intends or wants to happen, but there's nothing in the legislation as written that would prevent it from happening. We do appreciate the inclusion at our request and our suggestion of language dealing with potential conflicts of interest in regard to Roadmap Committee membership. With that, I yield back my time.
The author of the bill, the gentlelady from Arizona, Ms. Giffords, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Hall. I appreciate some of the comments that were made by the ranking member, and I know that there will be some amendments brought forward where we can more specifically talk about some of the concerns that the minority have. I would just like to state that one of the benefits of this committee is from a bipartisan standpoint. Members really understand and get renewable energy. We get clean energy, we understand it. I know some of the details is something that we go back and forth about, but I'm just excited by the fact that the United States has this tremendous potential for this resource. In fact, we have some of the best solar potential of any industrialized country in the world. We have enough solar power to power the whole country several times over. And, of course, these resources are not limited to states like my state of Arizona or even to the Southwest. Major companies in Europe and China have been very aggressive over the last several years in building up their manufacturing capacity and competing internationally to meet the demand. And if our policies and innovation models for solar energy don't change, the United States may simply transition from importing foreign oil, which we do tremendously right now, to importing foreign-made solar panels. Our country actually invented the first photovoltaic technologies, and we still have some of the smartest, most talented people in the world working to improve the efficiency and cost effectiveness of solar cells today. But in order to use our precious resource dollars as effectively as possible, these people, these patriots in fact, need a serious roadmap, and that's why I'm so pleased to offer today's bill. After many substantive discussions with a wide range of industry and academic leaders, as well as the Department of Energy, I believe there's a lot that the United States solar industry can learn from the experience of our national semiconductor industry years ago. About 20 years ago, the United States was in danger of losing its semiconductor industry to the Japanese. In response, the industry created the technology roadmap for semiconductors. The focus of the initiative was creating a roadmap that was to guide research and development efforts across the industry. And by increasing communication between the diverse members of the supply chain, the United States semiconductor industry was able to develop standards and avoid the duplication of research efforts. These organized coordination efforts gave rise to the United States semiconductor giants like Intel and AMD, and the United States continues to lead the world in semiconductor development. Today, solar researchers in the United States are almost in the same exact situation. To maintain a competitive edge, they must come together to meet their common pre-competition goals, whether in simulation, developing new materials, energy storage, power and grid management, mounting, or even weather forecasting. Mr. Chairman, this bill would require the Department of Energy to engage diverse stakeholders in the solar community and work across programs to create a comprehensive plan, a roadmap, to guide funding for research needed to make the United States the global center for solar innovation. The roadmap would identify short, medium, and long-term research goals and make recommendations on how to channel R&D resources to meet these goals. The bill would make DOE more responsive to our solar industry's needs and encourage increased collaboration and communication across technologies with well-vetted strategies. I'd like to thank my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for their contributions that have made this bill better. In fact, about 25 of the 28 changes in our manager's amendment were suggested or requested by the minority. I also look forward to supporting several amendments offered by both the majority and the minority today, and greatly appreciate the sponsorship of Chairman Gordon, Chairman Baird, Mr. McCall, Chairman Lipinski, Mr. Chandler, Mr. Lujan, and Mr. Tonko, as well as several members outside of the committee. Just another sign of the time and effort. I think if we will put together, again, and I want to be able to make sure that members understand that industry leaders like IBM, SIA, which has about 2,500 members, National Semiconductor Industry, also support this. We have letters of recommendation. We also consulted with and received verbal support from First Solar, Unisolar, Applied Materials, SunPower, PC Recycling. Again, many are members of SIA. In addition, we've also consulted with researchers from some of the premier solar universities, University of Delaware, Colorado State, George Washington University, as well as DOE's top program managers. Just in closing, the United States has an opportunity to lead and be a developer and exporter of solar technologies in the coming years and decades, and I want this committee and this bill to be a part of that. The bill is designed to advance this goal, and I urge my colleagues to support it.
Thank you, Ms. Giffords, for all your really diligent good work on bringing this bill to us. I know you have put a lot of effort into that. Does anyone else wish to be recognized? Mr. McCall is recognized.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, let me voice my bipartisan support for this bill. I was proud to be a co-sponsor of this bill. It's while no bill is perfect, I think it really takes this country in the direction we need to go in terms of investments towards energy independence. My hometown of Austin, Texas, has become a green technology center. The University of Texas obviously is working on a lot of projects in this area, and I appreciate the gentlelady's leadership and involvement of the private sector on this commission with Applied Materials in my district and many other solar companies. This is exactly the direction I think we need to go if we are talking about being a true leader in this area. The smart grid technology that's in this bill is also, I think, a very, very good point to make. Again, I think we come from states with a lot of sunshine, Arizona and Texas, and I think we need to harness that energy. We are beginning to do that, but there's a lot of advancement that needs to take place. There's a lot of technology challenges that need to take place, including storage, transportation, transmission of that energy, and bringing the price down. Once these photovoltaics, the price comes down to a level the everyday consumer can purchase. I believe that this is one of the most promising areas of future energy that we have for this country. And so let me just, again, voice my support, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McCall. Does anyone else wish to be recognized?
Mr. Chairman?
Let's see. Mr. Conahan is recognized.
I want to thank Ms. Giffords and Mr. McCall for their work on this bill and many others, and just point out this isn't just about states that have a lot of sun. One of the world leaders in solar technology and solar use is Germany, not exactly known as a country of sunshine, Other states around our country can use this technology, benefit from it, and I think this is a great way to keep us in the forefront of this technology going forward. So thank you.
Mr. Robacher is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me just note that before I proceed that I have a history of and a record of supporting solar energy research. When Republicans took the majority in 1995, I was the chairman of the Energy and Environment Subcommittee on this committee, and while we made dramatic cuts in other research like fusion research, I was not supportive of cutting solar power research. And so just to note that before I mention my objections to this particular bill. If this bill was simply increasing the level of funding for direct research, I would be much more supportive. But frankly, I just disagree with the entire approach that this bill represents otherwise. I mean, yes, we beat the Japanese in their competition from semiconductors, and I doubt it's because we had more central planning than the Japanese had. What we've got here is a suggestion that we are on the edge of this great changeover into solar power, which I agree with and have been pushing for. And we're going to set up a commission to set a roadmap. This just sounds, everything sounds, and have a central plan. I mean, do we really need a commission? In Russian, commission means Soviet. Do we really need to set up a Soviet commission and have our commissars, the commissioners, make a plan, the central plan, for a 5-year plan? Is that what's really going to bring progress, this change in our society? I don't think so. That's just a totally alien approach to what I believe. Now, there are honest disagreements as to how to bring about change. This is not the way to do it. We need to be encouraging dreamers who are not confined by a roadmap, entrepreneurs who are not confined by a roadmap, investors who are not confined by a roadmap. We need instead to free our people rather than restrict them and guide their energies. That's the whole difference in the why America has succeeded in the past, and not that we've had better commissions and better controls and better central plans than others. And let me just note one other thing about this bill, which is we can do all the research we want, we can have all the central plans we want into that research, but unless we've got an implementation of the research, we should be solar energy has reached a point now that we should be focusing on the implementation of solar energy, or, much more important, eliminating the impediments in our society to the utilization of solar energy. We have 150, Mr. Chairman, 150 requests to build solar energy plants in the desert, and we have at last come to the point where those solar plants would be competitive with gas-fired and coal-fired plants. But the Bureau of Land Management hasn't approved not one of the 150 applications to move forward and actually implement and put this technology to work. I have a piece of legislation. I'd invite all of my colleagues to join me, which would have the Bureau of Land Management facilitate these 150 requests, and let's start using solar energy. But I'd ask my colleagues to seriously consider that, and that will do much more to move along solar energy and actually promote the utilization of this great new technology that we've developed in these last 20 years than setting up a commission and having a 5-year plan and making sure that we've got the roadmap and the controls necessary to get us over the to the other end of this journey.
Mr. Gentleman,
I certainly will yield to the gentlelady who I respect.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rohrbacher, what you're talking about is, and you have been here on this committee for a very long period of time, incredibly promising. There's so much development happening in solar.
Right.
If you read the bill and if you really take the time to understand it, you'll understand that this is not a plan for the entire solar industry. For example, the Department of Defense has a requirement that by 2025, 25% of their energy will come from a renewable energy resource. So a lot of the research they're doing, they're moving forward in a very aggressive way, obviously not included in this. What this bill does is set a roadmap for federal R&D money coming from the Department of Energy. And that money has been spent in the past, will continue to get spent. But instead of having some bureaucrats in the Department of Energy deciding where the money is going to go, this is an opportunity for the private sector, for the universities, for DOE to collaborate together to actually have a plan rather than a piecemeal effort towards where federal R&D funds are going. So it's not a plan for the entire industry. There's a lot of innovation. There's a lot of other state funding and other types of federal dollars that will likely come forward.
Just reclaiming my time for one moment, and I know I'm actually run out of time, I'll just say that I think piecemeal is better than directed. In many ways, piecemeal and a broad approach is much better than an aimed approach. So with that said.
Okay, Comrade Rohrabacher's time has expired. Before we go to amendments, is there anyone else that would like to speak? Dr. Ehlers is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to reassure Mr. Rohrabacher that I don't think we have to worry about commissars in the Soviet here. In this country, we call them czars and put them in the White House. But having said that, and alienated more than half of my colleagues, I just want to, I know Mr. Bush did it too. But in any event, I commend Ms. Giffords for her efforts on this. This is a field that desperately needs encouragement because the economics just haven't been there. But they are very close to being there in a number of ways. First of all, you heard the comments about centralized power sources, which I am very skeptical of because you have to recognize that sunlight is everywhere. It's very diffuse. It is not good quality energy. It's what scientists call low quality energy because of the thermodynamics of the sun's rays. And it's very diffuse. It's everywhere. But if you have a diffuse source, you should have a diffuse set of collectors. And the best way to do that is to have solar panels, I'd rather call them solar shingles, on every house in the country. And that would be a very effective way of collecting solar energy. As someone observed Germany as a leader, the point is you do not need direct sunlight, but you do need sunlight. And so even with clouds, the UV still gets through. A lot of energy still gets through. And we can collect that. I spoke to some individuals from Dow Chemical just a few days ago, and they believe they are at the point where solar shingles will be competitive within a year with the price of ordinary shingles on housing. That totally changes the dynamic of this. Obviously, it weakens the case for centralized collection and sending it out through electrical lines, transmission lines, and so forth. If you can collect it on your house, use it on your house, that's by far the most efficient and least costly way of doing it. So suddenly we are reaching a point where there's a huge amount of development throughout the entire field of solar energy. And I think it's very important that the help that the Department of Energy can give is making clear what the physical parameters are that you have to deal with. Not every company that gets into the solar business totally understands all the physics involved in photovoltaic collectors and so forth. Whereas we have the NREL lab in Golden, Colorado, which has been studying this as part of DOE. It's been studying this for years. And that information and knowledge should be spread out. I would hope that this bill would lead, and it may have to be amended in time, but would lead to the DOE being a leader in solar energy, not in terms of just the funding research or anything like that, but also by saying to companies, helping companies who want to develop solar energy, this is a pathway that will work and this is a pathway that will not work. We have a lot of good scientists in DOE. They've done a lot of good work. and I sometimes think they keep it too much to themselves. And I always have chided the DOE directorate over the past years that the one thing that has been done by a government agency that very directly improved energy efficiency and cut costs for business was EPA, believe it or not, with their Green Lights program, where they went around the country and convinced business people that they could put in efficient lights in their factories, their plants, their offices, and save money and use less energy and have more light. And it worked. The payback was typically a year and a half for the cost of putting these in. That's the sort of information that DOE should be getting out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ehlers.
Yes.
Okay, it looks like no one else is requesting time.
I'd like time.
So I'm sure Mr. English would like to yield to you.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to be recognized, and I'd be happy to yield to Mr. Hall.
Yeah. Thank you, and thank the very capable chairman. Let me just say, I like the thrust of this bill. I like the goal of this bill. I like it so much, I went out to the beautiful state of Arizona with the author of this bill. Had a wonderful hearing out there. And I believe if we ever do control solar and have access to solar as to where it would be in what we'd call paying quantities in the oil patch, it would be wonderful. You could do without fossil fuels and never have any more fear of electrical breakdowns or the carbon in the air or anything. It's a lofty goal, and I pedestalize the author for a lot of reasons, and that's it doesn't do me. I don't feel good criticizing her bill, but let me just point out a few things that I hope she'll look at as we wander through and go ahead. I think you're going to pass it here. Previous votes we've taken today kind of indicate that you're probably going to prevail, and I have an old habit of that I followed all my life. I ignore the impossible and cooperate with the inevitable. So I'm trying to get along with the author of this bill. I'm trying to get along with the source of the bill, the chairman of the bill, those of you who are for the bill. But I want to point out that at least a third of this roadmap committee are made up of men and women of industry, and they have a right to vote on what they direct the DOE to do. The optics of this are that you have a committee whose membership could be primarily industry. It is primarily industry, a third, I think, telling the DOE where to direct taxpayer money. And that industry could be a part of the thrust and part of the people who serve as contractors to the government. And I don't see anything in here where it talks about it being open to the public. Maybe that's one reason. You know, they're explicitly exempted from the Federal Advisory Committee Act. I don't understand that, why that has to be in there, because the very first thing, one of the first things in the Advisory Act is each advisory committee meeting shall be open to the public. I don't see that anywhere in here. I think it's probably intended, but just not in here. On down on page 488, section 12 of the Federal Advisory Act, it says each agency shall keep records that will fully disclose the disposition of any funds which may be made at disposal of the advisory committee, and the nature of the extent of their activities. I think you're in a dangerous area there, and I hope you'll look at it very closely. And I laud the goal, but I've been lauding the goal on solar almost all my life, and I'm 86 years old, and I have a Wall Street Journal here that you might be interested in. It says renewable fuels may provide 25% of U.S. energy by 2025. That was in 2006. That's in November of this year. Now, I also have a Wall Street Journal dated August the 22nd, 1978. Solar power scene meeting 20% of needs by 2000. Carter, President Carter, that great man that gave away the Panama Canal, may seek outlay a boost. And it says federal planners have concluded that solar energy can contribute as much as 20% of the U.S. energy needed by so-and-so. And that's in 1978, August the 22nd. We've been pursuing this. It's a good pursuit, but we've never before put $2.2 billion or $2.25 billion on the line and turned it over to a board that has very few restrictions and very few thou shalt nots. I hope you'll look at that, and I hope we can work together on that as we go through. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Hall, and I'll give Senator Baker your best also. If there's no further discussion, then I ask unanimous consent that the bill is considered as read and open to an amendment at any point, and that the members proceed with the amendments in the order of the roster. Without objection, so ordered. First amendment on the roster is a manager's amendment offered by the gentlelady from Arizona, Ms. Giffords. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, I am, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3585, amendment number 064, offered by Ms. Giffords of Arizona.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentlelady for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. As I mentioned before in my opening remarks, we worked very closely with the minority in crafting this amendment. In fact, the vast majority of the text was suggested or provided by my colleagues and their staff on the other side of the aisle, and it did make the bill better. Beyond technical changes, the amendment adds important language to address potential issues of conflicts of interest among the Roadmap Committee members. Ranking Member Hall talked about this, actually capping the private industry to under 50%, so that by far his concerns that he brought up will not overrun the Roadmap Committee members, and it's setting a threshold of 30% at the base. And it provides further guidance on establishing a photovoltaic materials database. I'd like to go back to some of the concerns that were brought forward by Ranking Member Hall about the issues of the exemption of the Federal Advisory Committee Act. We want the Solar Technology Roadmap Committee to be as nimble as possible, with the ability to quickly respond to issues or opportunities as the need arises. While the FACA requirements make sense for some activities, such as guiding long-term basic research programs conducted by the DOE Office of Science and at NSF, they can be an obstacle to providing time-sensitive guidance for fast-growing industries like solar. We want the Roadmap Committee to have the flexibility it needs to be as effective as possible. A committee following FACA requirements must notice all meetings in the Federal Register well in advance. Also, FACA committees also have quorum requirements to meet, and in some cases it may be more appropriate or productive for a subgroup to work through particular issues or topics. In addition, FACA committees automatically expire every 2 years unless the administration works through the process of renewing them, which can further impede or delay committee actions. The Roadmap Committee's activities are still subject to the Freedom of Information Act. Again, we have worked with the minority to address any concerns about FACA exemption in the manager's amendment. Of course, we're happy to continue to work with Ranking Member Hall and other members. But going back to this larger point about the private sector and private industry, I mean, frankly, I'm a little surprised to be hearing from the minority the concerns about the involvement from the private sector. The Department of Energy is not going to be delivering this technology. The technology is delivered through the private sector, through these businesses. These are the folks on the front lines that are making the installations, that are rolling the panels out. They're not being manufactured at the Department of Energy. So I think it's exciting that we will have industry representation, and these folks are going to be at the table because, again, we're not buying our panels from the federal government. We're not buying the concentrated solar power. We're not buying that. I mean, the organization that's going to deliver it is the private sector.
Would the gentlelady yield for a question?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield.
No, I'm not a chairman.
I know, but I'm working through the chairman, Mr. Warbeck.
Thank you very much. Madam Chairman, let me just note that when you're talking about the industry having a say, if we're doing that, wouldn't it be better, rather than having some big corporate interests that have their particular idea of what they're going to benefit for their company by the use of specific federal research direction, wouldn't it be better just to provide industry in general with a tax credit for that research and let them determine and other companies determine for themselves what the best way to use that research, rather than having a central plan, et cetera, et cetera?
Yep. And Mr. Rohrabacher, I respectfully disagree. I think by having the private sector, by having the research institutions and the Department of Energy working collaboratively, so that eventually 75% of federal R&D funds will have to go through the roadmap. Not all, 25% will still not fall under the roadmap. But I think it's exciting to have a plan rather than having a piecemeal approach to the R&D funding.
At approximately 12:15, I'm being told we're going to have 4 amendments. So if there's no more discussion on the manager's amendment, then all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The second amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Peters. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
I am, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3585, amendment number 018, offered by Mr. Peters of Michigan.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 3585 is certainly an important piece of legislation that it's going to strengthen our nation's solar energy industry and help us meet our domestic goals for renewable energy production. The bill will establish a roadmap and demonstration program to further advance solar technologies, and I commend the committee for bringing this legislation forward. My home state of Michigan is currently a leader in manufacturing of solar cells. We are the home to great companies like United Solar Ovonic, which support many manufacturing and high-tech jobs in my area through their 2 production facilities in Auburn Hills and a global R&D headquarters in Troy. This company is also able to fill the void for workers in Greenville, Michigan, after the shutdown of an Electrolux plant, and now operates and employs people there making solar panels. High-tech jobs like these are the source of hope in my state and provide workers an opportunity to apply their skills in a new industry and enter the workforce of the 21st century. Federal partnership is critical to effectively develop new renewable industries, and those efforts should, to the greatest extent possible, work towards the creation of new U.S. jobs. These investments are key to restoring jobs lost in recent years. For this reason, my amendment asks the Secretary consider states that have been hit the hardest by the recession and which are experiencing high unemployment rates when providing awards under this program. There is a great potential to revitalize our domestic manufacturing base by strengthening the domestic solar industry. While states like Michigan and many others certainly have the existing infrastructure and workforce to manufacture more solar technologies, the United States continues to lag behind China, Japan, and Europe in the manufacturing of photovoltaic modules. We must commit at the federal level to increase our domestic production of this technology if we're going to truly take advantage of the full economic benefits of a growing solar industry. My amendment states that the Secretary will strongly consider projects utilizing solar technologies manufactured in the United States in carrying out the demonstration program. The amendment also specifies that representatives from the domestic solar industry will be represented on the Solar Technology Roadmap Committee. Federal dollars should work to create American jobs, and this amendment seeks to ensure that this new program works towards that end. I applaud the committee's commitment to bolstering the U.S. solar industry and the development of this roadmap. I'd like to thank Chairman Gordon, Ranking Member Hall, Chairman Baird, Ranking Member Inglis, and of the subcommittee, and Representative Giffords, the bill's sponsor, for considering this amendment and for bringing this important legislation forward. I urge my colleagues to support the adoption of my amendment and to join me in reporting the final bill favorably from this committee.
Is there further discussion on the amendment? If no, all in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The third amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Lujan. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3585, amendment number 028, offered by Mr. Lujan of New Mexico.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Congresswoman Giffords, for your work on this important bill. My amendment today expands the long-distance transmission research and development provision of the Solar Technology Roadmap to include the development of direct current and superconducting long-distance transmission technology. As our country increasingly uses the power of solar technology, states like New Mexico are positioned to be leaders in solar energy production. But we must invest in the development of technology that will make it easier to transfer power from region to region, with advanced power lines that can carry power for hundreds of miles with minimum loss. The development of direct current and superconducting long-distance transmission technology can promote energy efficiency and reliability so that any part of our country, including remote locations, can access the solar resources that are abundant in the U.S. Superconducting materials have almost no electrical resistance, so they can carry large amounts of electricity with minimal electricity loss. However, today's superconducting transmission technology is still very costly, and most superconducting electrical lines have only been used for short distances. Direct current transmission also reduces electricity loss from the line and can move large amounts of electricity from one point to another. Development and enhancement of these two technologies will benefit the long-distance transmission of electricity generated from the sun. I encourage my colleagues to support this amendment and the final bill, and I yield back my time.
Is there further discussion on the amendment? If no, the vote occurs. Excuse me, Mr. Robacher, Comrade Robacher.
Comrade Robacher, yes. Let me just note that Mr. Ehlers made some very significant points. He's a PhD. He's one of our great scientists, along with Congressman Bartlett, about what he expects will be the most effective use of solar power. I happen to agree with his assessment, although my general approach to energy is that we should be going at it at as many different directions as possible. Again, not trying to focus, but trying to go at a problem from many different directions. This amendment would permit us to utilize solar technology in yet another direction, meaning large-scale solar plants in the desert, which I believe are something that we should at least move forward with to see if they are cost-effective, and I believe at this point they are cost-effective. Again, Mr. Lujan, I support your amendment, but it also, we need more than research. Even if we do make it more efficient in transmitting solar energy that is produced by solar energy projects via the transmission lines that you're talking about, if the Bureau of Land Management will not give the companies that want to build these plants permission to do so, all of this research has been for nothing. It's been a total waste unless it's implemented. So I want to draw my attention to my colleagues again to my bill, H.R. 964, which would require the Bureau of Land Management to act upon the 150 applications they already have, rather than refusing to let anybody move forward in order to protect the habitat of some lizard or insect in the middle of the desert. Road maps aren't going to help if all the roads are closed and the bureaucrats won't let anybody proceed. So I support your amendment and hope that we do. And yes, I would yield to Mr. Bilbray the balance.
Thank you. I would speak in favor of the amendment because this transmission issue does not just apply to solar. It is across the board. The fact is the loss of power is a big issue. At the same time, I want to commend the gentleman's state of New Mexico, that they've led by more than just spending money and putting mandates out, but that their regulatory oversight is to a point to where our scientists in California who have major breakthrough in green technology have to pack up out of California and bring that technology to New Mexico because your state has regulatory oversight that is encouraging the development of true green technology, when California, who develops it, and this is really an analogy for the American people, that we can spend all the money on research, we can do all these breakthroughs, but if government doesn't get out of the way or government doesn't stop being obstructionist, you're not going to have it. New Mexico's been great about that. And so I think we need to move forward. But I also think we need to talk about this transmission issue of federal government and state governments have been mandating that people be on the grid, no matter where they live, rather than us going after, is anybody talking about getting people off the grid and making it legal to be off the grid, especially in rural areas like New Mexico, where we have federal mandates that you have to hook people up rather than get them off the grid and go to this technology. So I strongly support the amendment and think that we just got to look at this as one of those steps that need to be made. The other step with transmission is the federal government is not involved at all at siting the lines to be efficient like we do with our interstate highway system, we expect the private sector to do all that study and research rather than having a coordinated effort. And that transmission issue, I think, is great to raise at this time, and I yield back.
Back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Is there further discussion on the amendment? If no, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed upon. The fourth amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentlelady from Illinois. Ms. Biggert, are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3585, amendment number 001, offered by Mrs. Biggert of Illinois.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentlelady for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me just say that even though Illinois is not known as the Sunshine State, I do think that this is a good bill, but I have some concerns with it. My amendment would sunset the Solar Roadmap Committee after 5 years. And this would allow the department to put out a roadmap and update, but not dictate the focus of solar technology research, development, and demonstration, which, according to my reading, would be for 15 years. Utilizing the expertise of industry, national labs, academia, and other federal agencies to develop a roadmap for solar technology research is a good idea. But I think that we may be creating more government with less oversight and ultimately doing more harm than good. I support the development of advanced solar technologies and recognize the energy security it can provide for our country. I'm concerned, though, that we would be creating a fund stream that exists in perpetuity. And I think this is a crucial point for all research, establishing a timeline with goals and dedicated resources. Unfortunately, the Energy and Water Conference report we just voted on last week contains over 80 earmarks worth $76 million just in the Office of Science. And looking at that, there was an increase of $131 million over the 2009 appropriations, and that means that taking $76 million just for earmarks, and I think that this can have a devastating effect on research goals, and can we really afford to have this happen again? This is, $2 million that would be spent on this committee, really in perpetuity. So by sunsetting the Solar Roadmap Committee, we'll set a course for measurable results, and this is true of all of the acts, and this is that there is a sunset clause in there, and it would be great, that to say that this committee has done such a great job that we would want to put it back into existence. But I think that we need to have additional insight, and I think. But we would be free to reauthorize or extend the committee when that time comes. But I think we always use this, as President Reagan said, the closest thing to eternal life is a program in the federal government, and we don't want that to happen. So with that, I would urge my colleagues to support and yield back.
Ms. Giffords is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Biggert has 2 amendments today. I respectfully don't agree with her, the first one. The second one I do support. And let me tell you why. The purpose of this roadmap is to direct the DOE with a committee, private sector, public sector, researchers, a variety of members, and that committee is controlled, to look at short-term, which is defined by up to 2 years, midterm up to 7 years, and long-term up to 15 years research, development, and demonstration needs in solar technology. So the problem with sunsetting this act by 2015, it really doesn't make sense for the committee's continued existence because this is really the point of this committee, is to create that short, medium, and long-term plan for solar energy. So I understand Representative Biggert's concerns, but I really think it would really undercut the relevance of the committee's work if we were to sunset it in 2015.
Would the gentlelady lead you?
Yes.
Would there be a date that you think would be appropriate, like 2020, to come back and take a look at it?
And let me just say that, just like we're all lawmakers, and we work with the public sector by recommendations from private industry, from federal agencies. If it gets to the point where solar technology is so effective and we've been able to achieve some of these objectives, which I know that we can do if really we focus on solar technology, there may not be a need for it. But I don't think that by putting a commission together to ask them to, again, not direct all funding or all research and technology. It is federal R&D, 75% as it's ramped up. I think that would be a mistake to put a time frame on it.
I know the gentlelady doesn't believe in the, in the thresholds to bring it back and reconstitute it, basically in perpetuity. I think that, in all fairness, anybody that asks our constituents, sunsets are something that the public really, really feels strongly about. It's just where the sunset ought to be. And I strongly encourage the author of this bill to give a sunset so that you give that level of assurance that this is not just an institution for its sake, but it's one with an outcome base, and that sunset, I think, is a very important selling product for a bill that I strongly would like to support. Yield.
Will the gentlelady yield?
Would the gentlelady yield?
Yeah, I mean, I understand. I'll certainly take your recommendations into consideration. At this point, I don't think it's necessary. I mean, we have so far to go, and we are so far behind that at this point, I just don't. I think we have more to gain by making sure that the private sector and the public understand that we are truly committed to solar energy.
Will the gentlelady yield?
Yes.
Thank you. One third to one half of this committee is industry, and I think it behooves us to let's see with a review if they're doing their job, because this isn't something that we usually do when we're putting this much money in. 75% of this money over this will be $1.2 billion, and I think that it's really necessary that we have a review, and that's all a sunset is just to make sure that they're doing their job.
And Representative Biggert, if you read the bill, the committee must contain 11 members, and these members will serve 3-year terms. 1/3 of the industry must come from solar industry. That's the base. But we also are going to have representatives from other areas as well, from DOE, from the from research institutions. So we put a ceiling on top just because of some of the concerns that were brought up by the minority, but I really don't think it's necessary at this point to put a sunset provision in place.
If the gentlelady would yield, I'll point out that this committee obviously has jurisdiction of this bill and so has constant oversight and should be have the oversight and can at any point that it feels that it's not doing its job or his job has been done, can, just as we authorize it, we can deauthorize it. Okay. If there is no further questions.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Hall's recognized.
Yeah, I just once again want to address the amount of the bill, overall bill. That's not directed to this amendment. This amendment just requires a 15-year plan, and there's not any reason to fund the committee indefinitely at taxpayers' expense. But all this would be taken care of if they only left it under the Federal Advisory Committee Act. And I don't understand why they take it out from under it, because at least 1/3 of this committee is made up of industry. They absolutely ought to be under here. It's a federal act. It's an advisory committee, and it ought to be under the Federal Advisory Committee Act. That way it'd take care of this amendment. It'd take care of any amendment about it being open to the public. Nowhere in here does it say it's open to the public, or we know when the openings are going to be. Nowhere in here does it say they're going to be available for public inspection. Nowhere do they say the detailed minutes of everything. All that would be required by the Federal Advisory Act. Even the disposition of any funds, it's very important here, where they're telling the Department of Energy how to spend that money and how much money to spend and when to spend it. That's controlled by the Federal Advisory Committees Act. Compliance of the numbers. Any member of advisory committee or the staff of any advisory committee shall receive compensation in a rate as set by the Federal Advisory Committee Act. Those things are all taken care of. I go a step forward on that, other than the disposition of funds. All those things would take care of if they didn't put these 15% of these people, or 1/3 of these people, out of industry who have a direct interest in it. There's no way in the world that you can control them and keep them from voting for something that could be contra to the public good when it's to the good of the industry involved. And I think that gives rise to a lot of questions that are going to be brought up from this point forward.
Parliamentary inquiry.
I support the amendment.
Parliamentary inquiry.
Yes, sir, Mr. Bilbrey.
Mr. Chairman, would it be appropriate to amend the motion, the amendment before us, a second?
A secondary amendment would be
When you felt it was appropriate, I'd like to do a secondary amendment.
to this amendment.
Yes.
Then it would be appropriate now.
I would move that we amend the amendment to move the date to 2020. And to speak to the amendment, first of all, I'm really kind of taken back at some of the conversations going on from our side of the aisle. I know that Mr. Hall flashes back to his days when he was a member of another political affiliation that took a habit of attacking participation of industry. So I have to say that I think the participation of industry is very important here, and I think the authors put together a good coalition on this.
Mr. Bilbrey, if I would suggest either Ms. Biggert needs to accept that, or you need to put it in writing at the desk.
Okay. That's why I was doing a parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Chairman.
If the gentleman will yield.
Yes.
The problem is that the bill actually sunsets at 2015. So we would even be extending any overview. The authorization is 2015, so we would be really extending the committee to be reauthorized for another 5 years.
Okay, then if, the point being your motion was to...
I'll point out that Ms. Biggert is somewhat correct in that the authorization, it doesn't end. I mean, it's not sunsetted, but the authorization would expire, at which time, like we sometimes do, we either could reauthorize it or not reauthorize it.
Which way 2015 was a good time to review.
No, my
I withdraw my
understanding is that
motion.
you're not accepting the, okay, and
Correct.
the gentleman
Would the
withdraws
gentleman
second.
yield to me 1 minute before he yields
just
back?
he just withdrew his amendment. Do you still want to speak to it?
Yes, I would like to. Even when I was a
Record.
Democrat, gentleman from California, I supported industry and jobs, and I support them as a Republican. I don't believe, though, that they ought to have control of the funding and how the money's spent or any direction to Congress or to the Department of Energy in something that they could be personally involved in. I want to have their input, but I don't want to have their dictating terms that benefit them for some of their failures.
Would the gentleman yield?
I sure do.
That is the reason why I believe in at least having some sunsets down the line to where the burden of proof to be able to continue authorizations in there, because then there's a level of comfort that if a mistake is made today, at least we will have within the next few years the ability to go over it again and correct these problems. So it gives more trust at trying new things and moving forward when you know that there's a break that you've got on there and there's a sign-off that's in the future. So that level of confidence would be much higher for you that if there's a mistake, the sunset allows you to correct it. Now you,
Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman?
Dr. Bartlett is recognized.
Let me ask a question. If, in fact, the authorization expires in 2015, if the committee did not reauthorize it, have we not sunset the commission?
The commission would not be sunsetted, but there would be no funds, money for it. So, in effect...
So, in effect, it is sunset.
Yes. Yeah. It is the same effect, yes, sir.
Okay. So then, since the authorization expires in 2015, we have to look at that time as whether or not we want to continue this commission, do we not?
You're correct.
Would that not meet the goal of the amendment? And so the amendment then is a perfectly harmless amendment. Why not accept it? It doesn't do anything.
Will the gentleman yield?
Be happy to.
I think that it's not clear because you're talking about going forward the 7 years, the 3 years, the 7 years, etc. So it's not clear that you're ending that or it's sunsetting.
Yeah. Reclaiming my time. I can't understand why it takes.
If I could, I need to, I think, better correct my earlier statement.
Okay.
A sunset would make it go away. If the authorization expired, the appropriators could still appropriate money for it. So It's similar, but not the same.
But if we sunset it, they can appropriate money whether or not, can't they?
I would assume that at that time there would not be a commission.
That hasn't stopped them in the past from funding things that we have discontinued. Thank you very much.
Good effort, but okay. Is there any further
Chairman?
Yes, sir. Mr. Grayson.
I just want to say that we'd love to have Mr. Hall come back to our party, and all is forgiven.
With 8.5 minutes to go, then if there's no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Opposed, no. No. The noes appear to have it. The amendment is not agreed to. And we will, at this time, I regret to have to ask you to come back. We have about 8 minutes to go on the vote. Well, 8 official minutes to go on the vote. We have 4 votes, and
Mr. Chairman, could you give us about a 10-minute extra time to get a sandwich or something?
Why don't we? It was suggested 1:15, but I don't know if we can get those votes done by that time. What about 1:30? Does anyone just? And so we will.
1:35.
Okay. Again, I thank the committee for being here. We will adjourn until 1:30, at which time we will complete this bill and go into and complete the following bill. The committee will come back to order, and Ms. Bickert is not here now, and so Dr. Bartlett has acquiesced to moving up. Oh, is he? Okay, here she is then. So, Dr. Bartlett, we'll put you back in your normal order. The 5th amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentlelady from Illinois. Ms. Bickert, are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3585, amendment number 003, offered by Mrs. Biggert of Illinois.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you.
I recognize the gentlelady for 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Pardon me. Excuse me.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, my amendment would require the Secretary, when providing grants to fund demonstration projects for the solar technology, to focus on those that provide the greatest potential to reduce energy costs for consumers. Recent reports show that a typical homeowner pays 0.04 cents to 7.07 per kilowatt hour for electricity. By contrast, existing solar technology would require a cost of 0.20 or 0.25 per kilowatt hour. So this results in a significant difference in cost for the average consumer. We can support solar technology demonstration and significant investment by including ways to reduce the cost for consumers in our initial research goals. So my amendment is a common sense one that requires the Secretary to keep the end user, the consumer, in mind, and I would urge my colleagues to support it and yield back.
Does anyone else wish to discuss the amendment? If not, then Ms. Biggert, thank you for for making this bill better, and we will accept this amendment. Thank you.
If the gentleman would yield.
Yes.
I would thank you and thank Chairman Giffords for supporting the amendment. Thank you.
Okay. All in favor of the amendment, say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and thank you, Ms. Biggert. The sixth amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Maryland, Dr. Bartlett. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3585, amendment number 016, offered by Mr. Bartlett of Maryland.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. Recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Chairman Gordon and Ranking Member Hall. I've worked very closely with Congresswoman Giffords and committee staff to draft this amendment. It makes two changes in Section 105 concerning demonstration projects. First, it will strengthen the ability of U.S. companies to regain America's world leadership in solar technology by expanding from at least 3 to no more than 5 the number of large demonstration projects over 30 megawatts. It also clarifies that these large projects will be technology neutral. Second, it will maximize benefits to society and taxpayers from these demonstration projects by adding a requirement to, and I quote, promote overall electric infrastructure reliability and sustainability should grid functions be disrupted or damaged, end quote. Our grid, while very efficient and cost-effective, is also remarkably vulnerable to natural disaster or deliberate attack. Furthermore, the capability of operating independently of the grid to ensure uninterrupted electricity at critical sites and for vital missions is not incorporated into the present requirements for demonstration projects in Section 105 of H.R. 3585. This amendment ensures that solar energy technologies will contribute to strengthening our country's economy, environment, and national security, and I appreciate very much the support that I've had for this. Thank you very much, and yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Bartlett. We agree. It's an excellent amendment, and again, one more way to make this bill better. If there's no further discussion, all in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. The ayes have it. The seventh amendment on the, let's see, Mr. Brown is not here. Let's see if, does anyone want to do his, or should we, or Mr. Bilbrey, are you prepared to come up to bat?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
The ninth amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Bilbrey. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3585, amendment number 005, offered by Mr. Bill Bray of California.
Ask for unanimous consent for the
Okay, I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't plan on using the 5 minutes. I've used enough of your time already today. But as pointed out by the author of the underlying bill, the fact is that the technology called solar voltaics were actually invented here in the United States, and sadly, the major production of it has gone overseas. A lot of members may not know that even the basic technology of solar water heating was invented here in the 1880s by a company named Day and Night. The fact is, our technology breakthroughs are so quickly adapted or stolen by other countries. And my amendment just basically tries to protect the proprietary information and trade secrets of the companies that participate in this program. It will just amend page 20, line 15, and specifically identifies the fact that it should include the protection for proprietary information, trade secrets, and other confidential business information. Very short, very precise, but could be very important for our future to make sure that our future breakthroughs stay in the United States as much as possible. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Is there further discussion?
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking
Member Hall.
Well, I was going to say the temporary ranking member, Mr. Bilbrey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate
Robacher, excuse me.
Now we've got him right where we want him. Totally confused.
They all look the same in California.
Well, when you got suntan, you just assume you do, right?
Mr. Chairman, what Mr. Bilbrey is bringing up is what I think that especially those people who are backing this legislation need to look at as an alternative to simply creating new authorities within the system, or just simply spending more money as directed by those people within the governmental system. There are ways that that we and things we need to do that will facilitate the actual implementation and the development of solar energy in this country without great cost or without taking control of large amounts of revenue and directing them as this whatever elite group decides should be directed. One of, we mentioned earlier, were tax credits, but another is to pay attention to the intellectual property rights of those people who own the research and have developed the products themselves. There's a piece of legislation making its way through Congress, which is supposedly a patent reform bill. Every one of the individual inventors around the country are scared to death of this bill because what it does is empower the big guys to basically take their inventions and thus take away the incentive for people to invest in this very, very solid initial research that comes up with these breakthrough technologies. So I would suggest that as we move forward in discussion of how to deal with solar energy, how to make sure this technology is brought to play, that we look at these type of alternatives and think of them as alternatives to what is being proposed. And that is, please consider the piece of legislation that's going to be called patent reform when in reality it's what I call the Steal American Technologies Act, because it will open up theft of the little guys and really, by the way, I've talked to many people in the solar industry who've told me had those rules been in existence that they're trying to now put in place via this new patent bill, they would never have been able to invent the things and develop the solar technologies that they have, because they've been in production in China before these guys even got their patents. So with that said, I agree with what Mr. Bilbray's been saying and add that to the debate today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Robacher. You're very persuasive. I think this would be a good amendment. If there's no further discussion, then all in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. The ayes have it. The amendment passes. And we'll now go back to the Seventh Amendment with Mr. Brown. The Seventh Amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Mr. Brown, are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
I'm from Georgia, Mr.
Oh, I'm
Chairman.
sorry. I know that.
I don't sound like a Californian.
Southern California.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3585, Amendment Number 140, offered by Mr. Brown of Georgia.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. Recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I offer this amendment as a way to give the Secretary of Energy some discretion in choosing the best way to allocate funding for research, development, and demonstration of solar technology. I'm concerned that the bill as drafted gives way too much power to the Solar Roadmap Committee that must be comprised of at least 1/3 of the energy of the industry. I'm not comfortable with requiring that 75% of the funding be required to go to activities chosen by such a committee. This leaves the Secretary with no choices if he feels such activities are inappropriate, or if he determines or she determines another technology not considered by the committee, for whatever reason, should receive more than 25% of the funding given to the department. My amendment would require the Secretary to devote a percentage of the research chosen by the committee, but would not require it to be a set amount. I feel much more comfortable having the Secretary, who is confirmed by the Senate and has some accountability to the Congress, making the decisions on funding with input from the Roadmap Committee, but not being dictated to by it. Thank you very much for the opportunity to submit this amendment for consideration, Mr. Chairman. I encourage everyone to vote for this common sense amendment to give the Secretary some flexibility and be able to make the choices that he or she needs, whoever that Secretary may be, now and in the future. and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Ms. Giffords is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Brown, I hear your concerns, but I want all the members on the committee to know that it is, in fact, the Secretary of the Department of Energy that will be making the selection for the committee members, so he or she will really have a tremendous amount of discretion about who is going to be the member sitting on the 11-member commission. I've also heard earlier some concerns about the 75% number. As we all know, looking at the bill, it ramps up. It starts with 30% in fiscal year 2012 and culminating in 75% in fiscal year 2015. And I understand that 75% is a significant majority of the total funding for solar R&D. But again, looking at the purpose of the bill, what we would do is establish a multi-stakeholder process for creating a long-term plan to direct DOE's efforts for solar R&D development. The resulting plan or the roadmap would also be published for everyone to see. So in terms of transparency and long-term thinking and integration of diverse views, this process would far exceed anything required of EERE today. What's more, the roadmap idea is not one that has been pulled out of the blue. As I said in my opening statements, this is based after a highly successful semiconductor technology roadmap. The process has been widely hailed as contributed to a steady and rapid technological advancement in the semiconductor industry. In contrast, right now, R&D funding decisions at EERE is made by a program manager with the support of his or her staff according to whatever rationale he or she sees fit. There is no transparency currently. There is no long-term plan. There is no requirement for consultation with industry or any other stakeholders. It's just a small group of people in an office at the Department of Energy. I can't understand why members would object to allocating more funding to the results of a roadmap process rather than the status quo. For anyone concerned with ensuring the wise use of taxpayer dollars, they should take at heart this roadmap process because it's designed to integrate the idea of a wide variety of solar experts from a wide range of perspectives in guiding R&D funding. The gradual increase in the percentage of required allocation would provide for a smooth transition to the roadmap, and even at the end of the ramp-up, fully 25% of the R&D budget would still be free to be allocated to projects that fall outside the purview of this multi-stakeholder effort.
Would the gentlelady yield?
Yes, I will yield, Mr. Brown.
Well, I understand that the Secretary of Energy could nominate whoever he wants to for this committee, and I understand also that a third, up to a half of the committee members could be out of industry itself. My concern is not so much that well, it is how this committee is made up, but also who makes the decisions. When the Secretary puts forth the committee, whatever it might be, it's a minimum of 11, there's no maximum number there, that committee could do whatever that they want to with 75%. And I think it's just, I think everybody needs some accountability and show responsibility, and the Energy Secretary is going to be the best way to do that, and by reducing the amount and letting the Energy Secretary determine what kind of amount is needed, I think it just improves this bill and allows the flexibility to the Secretary that Secretary needs to be able to make sure that the roadmap committee doesn't dictate exactly what's going on against what's best policy. So that's the reason I put forth this amendment. I think it's a great amendment. I think it gives the Energy Secretary the flexibility the Secretary needs, and I think it's critical for us to not lock the Secretary of Energy into a formula, particularly when the Roadmap Committee is going to dictate 75%. So I think the Secretary of Energy should be able to make a whole lot of decisions, and the Secretary of Energy could give up to 75% if they decided to do so. So it's not to try to change from the roadmap. My amendment is just to try to give the Secretary of the Energy the flexibility that they need. And I'll yield back.
Mr. Brown, just for your assurance, and I appreciate your concerns, but we have worked extensively with the Department of Energy when crafting this legislation, and they are in support of it. Also, looking at what would be required, the solar roadmap is subject to a comprehensive revision every 3 years and may be updated annually as needed. So there is going to be a more transparent process with us, the members of Congress, to understand, again, how these decisions are being made and where the funding is going. So I just would like to assure you, obviously I don't support your amendment because I don't believe it's the best way to determine the best form of solar policy. I think that this is a really integrated plan that will provide for a more focused and targeted approach, but also a more comprehensive approach because, again, they can determine if they want to fund small projects, large projects, concentrated solar power, photovoltaics, the next type of solar technology that may come. It's fast changing, it's got some flexibility, but I think the Secretary of the Department of Energy will have a tremendous amount of say in the process.
The lady's time has expired. Anyone else wish to make a comment?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir. Mr. Smith is recognized. 5 minutes.
Yield time to Mr. Brown.
I thank you, Mr. Smith, for yielding time. There's nothing in this bill that requires transparency. There's nothing that in this bill that requires open meetings. And so it can be done very secretly. It could be done with no transparency. And the Secretary of Energy, once it's put into place, is going to lose control over 75%. And I think that's just untenable. It's just something that, even though we're going to have the possibility of a revision on a yearly basis, and it has a 3-year period, I think we need to give the Secretary of Energy a whole lot more flexibility, and I appreciate Ms. Gifford's comments. I really do, and she makes a very good argument, but it's not strong enough to convince me that the Secretary of Energy doesn't need the flexibility that I think that Secretary should have. And we don't know who the Secretary of Energy is going to be 6 months from now. It may be the same one we have today. It may be someone else. And so I think it's critical that we give the Secretary of Energy the flexibility that they need, and that's the reason I offered the amendment, and I encourage others to support it. Now I yield back. Thank you, Mr.
Brown, would you please yield me some time?
Yeah. Oh, Ms. Smith.
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Smith. If you look at the bill, there actually is quite a bit of transparency. First of all, the bill requires the Department of Energy to study and publish the best practices to improve performance of photovoltaic installations. The study will also examine the effectiveness of federal, state, and local incentives to enhance system performance. Also, and this was, of course, improved upon by Mr. Bartlett, there are solar projects ranging from 1 to 3 megawatts in size, and also projects greater than 30 megawatts in size that are going to be funded. And, of course, we're all going to know about those projects and be interested to see where they end up. The interagency activities identified and recommended from the Solar Technology Roadmap should be coordinated by the Director of OSTP. And again, because this is actually a really transparent process, we will all, unlike we currently have with EERE, be very much in the know of what the decisions of the roadmap and the committee members, what they come up with. This, is precisely why this bill is being brought forward, is because we don't have transparency right now. I mean, this is an opportunity for the private sector and the public sector research institutions to all have an important voice in determining where our federal R&D dollars go towards.
Thank you. And if there's no further discussion, then, Mr. Hall is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'll just very briefly, of course, I support Dr. Brown's amendment. I don't feel that the Secretary's hands to the roadmap ought to be tied, requiring him to use 75% of his appropriated funds. And, when they appoint this into this committee from industry, this 15%? A third. Is that 33 and a third percent? Remember my mathematics background. But you want good people on that committee, and I want good industry people on the committee, like Rex Tillerson of Exxon or Norm Augustine's been on almost every known and led most of the real studies that have been made by different presidents, and you want that type of person on there. And if they're on there, it just seems to me that you'd be afraid of having people on the committee that have a self-promoting interest. And if something came up with Lockheed, why, probably Augustine would be obligated to take their position and to report it, but still take that position, or Rex Tillerson or whoever else is running Exxon at that time. Maybe the president might be running it, or the government, or somebody here, but they would have a self-promoting interest and could reward their own failure, and would probably be so required to vote to support whatever position they take. I just think decisions about which research activities to fund ought to be left to the Secretary's discretion. That advice of industry, but where they have a financial decision to make, they ought to be watched by someone if the bill itself explicitly exempts them from the Federal Advisory Committee Act. I don't know of any major committee that hadn't been guided by that or relegated by that, or if they're excluded from that, they had a very definite reason other than that it would slow them down, and that's all I've heard so far. So what if you have $2.5 billion involved? They ought to go a little bit slow. But at this rate, I think if you leave it to the Secretary's discretion, it would help some.
Would the gentleman yield?
I sure do. I'd rather not. Who's asking me? Yeah, Dr. Brown, I do yield to you, sir. I didn't want Miss Gifford to have to get after me anymore.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hall. I appreciate that. Ms. Gifford, since it's your bill, I'm sure I don't have to remind you that the reporting, the dissemination of results, as part of section of Title II is not required under the roadmap part of the bill. So there is, in the roadmap portion of the bill, there's nothing that will guarantee any transparency or any openness, so the reporting is only required under Title II of this bill, if I'm not mistaken, and so it's. I just want to remind the committee that under the roadmap portion there is no reporting necessary required. There is no transparency required. Thus, the only way that we're going to have the transparency, the only way we're going to have the ability to have at least a portion of it being transparent and required on the roadmap portion is by having the Secretary of Energy have the wherewithal to direct what the Secretary wants to do. And so it's, I think it's important to not handcuff the Secretary, but to allow the Secretary to have some flexibility and give the Secretary the option of giving 75% or 100% to the recommendations of the Roadmap Committee, but it's by locking it in with a set formula of 75%, then I think we're hamstringing the Secretary, we're hamstringing the American public to have the transparency that they deserve, and so I think it's important for us to give the Secretary the flexibility. I still hope that folks on your side will see fit to vote for my amendment, and I yield back.
Mr. McCall is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just had a question of clarification to the author of the bill. Is this committee subject to the Freedom of Information Act?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Just in terms of the transparency, in terms of the meetings, that would be subject to the FOIA. Okay.
Yeah.
I yield back. Thanks.
Mr. McCall, if you can yield me some of your time, and we can hear from staff specifically about the transparency.
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
The roadmap needs to be submitted to both Congress and the Secretary of Energy, so it would be submitted publicly.
And with that, I yield back.
Well, Mr. McCall, would you yield, please?
Yes, I yield to Dr. Brown.
Okay. There's no way to know how the decisions were made, what the process was, or anything else. Just it's when we go through the Freedom of Information Act, which would be the only way to know. We still couldn't get the process revealed. We couldn't get the decision-making thoughts reveal to the American public. And again, we just lock it into 75% with this bill the way it is, and so I don't think that's in the best interest of. And the Secretary could decide to give 100% of the funds to what the Roadmap Committee recommends. It's all if my amendment passes, everything will be at the discretion, and only a percentage is required, but that percentage could be set by the Secretary of Energy. And I just think it makes sense to give this Secretary that kind of flexibility.
Yeah, and I appreciate the gentleman's arguments. I just wanted the clarification that this is subject to congressional review and oversight and to the FOIA as well, and I think that is the case.
Yeah, Mr. McCall, I don't mean to beat a dead horse, but right now the decisions are being made by the EERE, by a program manager with their staff in an office at the DOE with absolutely no requirement for any consultation with the industry, with Congress, with researchers. Right now, none of that is happening. It's just a small group of people stuck away at the DOE. I mean, this is a process, a public process, where we're going to have the best and the brightest in the industry, private sector, public sector universities, and actually have a plan. So, Mr. Brown, I mean, I understand your concerns, and obviously, precisely because we have the same concerns, this is why the roadmap is being created.
The gentlelady yield.
It's not my time to yield.
I guess reclaim my
Mr.
time.
McCall will yield to you.
Reclaim my time. I yield to Dr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. McCall.
Sure.
I don't think anything should be decided in the dark, and I agree with the gentlelady that we need to make some changes of the process. But the process today is flawed, and I congratulate the gentlelady for bringing that forward. The biggest objection I have is that we don't have a flexibility for the Secretary to be able to look at valid awards that are outside that 25% that they will have. And so there may be other things that the Secretary would like to look at, but the Roadmap Committee is not recommended, and that's not going to be available under this current bill without my amendment. My amendment will just give the flexibility to the Secretary, and I think it's critical that the Secretary have that flexibility, and I yield back.
And reclaim my time,
Yield.
Chairman.
Gentleman, yield to me.
I'd be happy to yield.
Yeah, that's just like a general indictment of the lack of oversight by Republicans or Democrats. That's the key to it. They are subject, though, to an advisory committee, and that's their oversight.
Mm-hmm. And reclaim my time, and I know I'm out of step with my party on this particular piece of legislation, but I like the idea of the private industry, academia, national labs, collaborating together, making these decisions rather than some bureaucrats behind closed doors, in Washington. And I think that's the part of this bill that I think is a good feature to it. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McCall. If there's no further discussion on the amendment, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. The eighth amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia. Mr. Brown, are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, I am, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad you moved me to my proper place. I appreciate it.
I thought you'd feel more
and I know my
there.
place around here, too. So I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3585, amendment number 141, offered by Mr. Brown of Georgia.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I would like to thank you for allowing me to submit my amendment for consideration here today. As my colleagues have already stated, our country is in dire need of a strong and stable domestic energy supply. I've authored and co-sponsored many pieces of legislation designed to do just that. From tearing down the barriers that exist today on new nuclear power sources to allowing for safer and environmentally friendly oil and gas exploration to new wind and hydroelectricity projects. We have it in our power to allow our own private industries to solve the problems set before us today. Mr. Chairman, I believe we should be passing legislation which will encourage innovation and expansion in all of these arenas. The energy solution we are focusing on today is on solar energy, and with good reason. As our fellow committee members, Ms. Giffords and Mr. Rohrbach, have often stated, the technological advances in this specific field are almost endless and are growing more numerous by the day. And they're not only the ones among us who know firsthand about the great potential available in this field. We should be doing all that we can to foster that potential and to scale back the regulatory burdens that exist in our markets to allow easier pathways for private industry to help make that goal a reality. But we must also recognize one plain and simple fact. We do not currently have enough money to do all of the things that we all would like to do. The goal of energy independence is rightfully centered around getting our country away from its dependence on specific foreign countries who at best have very shaky internal leadership and at worst are outright hostile toward America. But realizing this noble and vital goal cannot come at the expense of shifting our monetary needs onto still other countries that have proven to be unpredictable towards us in even the most stable of economic times. I think that we can all agree that our current economic situation is far from stable. So with an eye towards balancing the notable self-interest of energy independence and sustaining a stable monetary system, the amendment I have offered today would freeze the amount authorized in this legislation for the next 5 years at $200 million each year. Mr. Chairman, while I'm still not certain that there should be a federal role in the expansion of solar energy, other than to make it easier for the private sector to do so, I'm quite certain that we simply do not have the monetary resources to spend well over $2 billion over the next 5 years out of the federal treasury. And our children and our grandchildren certainly cannot afford that bill. I ask my colleagues to understand that our financial resources are not unlimited. We must be responsible with our spending. We must also be aware that the debt we force upon our children and grandchildren, even in the pursuit of noble and erstwhile project, is still debt. So I ask my colleagues to support my amendment, which I hope will start us down the co-equal path of fiscal and energy independence. The amendment reduces it to $200 million in each of the next 3 years. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thanks, Dr. Brown. Ms. Giffords is recognized.
Thank you. Dr. Brown, I hear your concerns, but I would like to remind the members of the committee that your amendment would cap the authorization for solar R&D at $200 million per year, which is $50 million less than was authorized in fiscal year 09 in the Energy Policy Act of 2005. This bill was, of course, passed by the Republican-led Congress. I believe the best justification for the proposed authorization levels for this bill comes from taking a historical look at the investment that we've made in energy R&D. Between 1978 and 2005, the United States government spent $30 billion on R&D for nuclear energy alone. We spent another $24 billion on fossil fuel research, but during the same time period, we spent less than $6.5 billion on solar energy. More than half of that research was actually performed prior to 1985, which was 25 years ago. Now, maybe some people think these disparities are appropriate. Maybe they think solar does not merit the same level of investment because it's not able to provide as much energy as those other technologies. But today, that's simply false. Our solar resources are vast in scale, and they are capable of making a significant contribution to our energy needs. Using today's technology, solar power could meet the electricity demands of the United States on a square piece of land only 100 by 100 miles or 10,000 square miles. That's just 1/4 of the land area currently covered by artificial lakes behind hydroelectric dams, which provide less than 10% of our nation's electricity. Scott Stevens, an engineer with the Solar Energy Technology Program at the Department of Energy, recently stated publicly that with the right incentives, solar power has the potential to provide 20%, again, again, 20% of America's electricity needs by the year 2030. That's equal to the amount of power currently provided by nuclear power plants. Yet to date, we have spent just 1/10 the resources developing solar technologies than we've spent developing nuclear. In the last 30 years, we've spent 4 times more money developing coal technology than solar, and burning coal is a technology that's over 150 years old. At the end of the term covered in my bill, it would authorize $550 million to solar R&D. At the peak of the energy crisis in the 1970s, we spent $3 billion a year on nuclear power development and $1.8 billion on fossil fuels in 2007 dollars. So as I've said before, solar is not a fringe energy. Solar today specifically is really serious. I've spoken many times in this committee about the benefits of solar power, economic growth and good jobs, increased security, and reduced environmental impacts. It is time for our investment in this resource to match the scale of the opportunity before us. In fiscal year 2011, the Solar Technology Roadmap would authorize $350 million, which is only about 10% of today's energy R&D budget. As the Solar Technology Roadmap ramps up, it will allow solar to fulfill its full potential by giving it the funding it needs to become a mature energy technology. With that, I yield back my time.
Would the gentlelady yield?
Yes, Mr. Brown.
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate it, Ms. Gifford. I'm all in favor of solar energy. I really am, and we've seen tremendous strides in that field just through the private sector. And I don't think the federal government is the sole arbiter of solar energy or any energy sources. I think the marketplace is going to be the best way to do that, and I want to facilitate the development of all these technologies. You talk about 100 miles, about 100-mile grid that could provide all the electrical energy. I don't think you want to put that in Arizona, but and take up that kind of space there, and I don't think your constituents would either. But the last time that we did an authorization under Republican leadership, we were in a different economic times than we are today. We are borrowing from our grandchildren's future. And in fact, they're going to live at a lower standard of living today if we don't stop the outrageous spending here in Congress. I'm all for solar energy.
And Mr. Brown,
and when families have economic hard times, they tighten their belts and they stop spending money. Now, my amendment wouldn't.
Mr. Brown, I'm reclaiming my time.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
You know, we import over 60% of our energy here in the United States right now, about $400 billion. This is the largest transference of wealth. Weaning our dependency off of foreign energy is a national security priority. It's a priority because our growth will continue, our needs for energy will continue, yet without aggressive, smart steps like the Solar Technology Roadmap, we won't get there. Other countries get it, they're moving forward, we are falling behind. This is a plan to put us on the right path. I am concerned about debt and deficit just like you are, but unless we take some aggressive steps, like actually planning for this new type of energy, we will continue to be left in the dust.
The gentlelady's time has expired, and we have enjoyed the conversation between the gentlelady and Dr. Brown. But if there's no further discussion,
I'd like to.
Mr. Hall is recognized.
I don't even know what I want to say.
You want to think about it while we vote here?
I'd like to brag on the author a little more if I could, but and I want to, and I will. And we're on a bill here today. All of us are in kind of a bind on this because we're all pro-solar. We all know we need solar. We know solar could be the answer to every problem we have, power-wise. And I think I'd feel bad if I left here and had voted against the bill, a solar bill. But with this amendment, Mr. Brown, he's given us a little bit of cover there because we can always say, yeah, we voted to knock it down to $600 million. But that brings me to talking about money, you know. Even in the bailouts, you know, they did $800 billion. If they just waited a little bit there, and when the new president came in and asked for it, and the old president joined him, when Bush and Obama got together, that passed that $800 billion bailout bill. or it wouldn't have passed. But they were there then, Mr. Chairman, with $450 billion in FDIC that they could have used, and I happen to know that was their fallback position. They could have used that instead, and they wouldn't have thrown away that $369 billion they threw at AIG. So you can throw too much money at anything, but we're not without money here. And yes, Madam Author, they did authorize that much money, but they didn't appropriate it. It's just, it didn't, I don't believe that happened. If it did, somebody can correct me on it. I'm pretty sure it didn't. And that's kind of the way it would happen here. And here, we're also getting for solar, they get $200 million for 2 years from stimulus bill. That's added onto this. The annual current budget gives them a couple of $100 million or $250 million per year. It seems like it looks like $2.525 billion. It's just really, and maybe if we're just appropriating and not authorizing it, maybe that's okay. And I have the problem of asking for a vote on it when we could just vote it out, voice vote it, and everybody can always claim they voted either way. But I really have a hard time voting against a solar bill, and this is a good solar bill. The only problem I really have with it is the amount, and the amount overshadows so much the fact that I wanted the coverage of the national of that, what's the name of that? The federal committee to use their regulations, normal regulations you use on something like this. Now, that's about all I have to say. At least, well, I'm not really ready to quit talking. I would hope that we can pass this bill, and then we can have some talks with you on down the line on what we're going to do with all this money and how they're going to allocate it and how they're going to report it, and maybe get a little more strength in your bill as to the requirements for notice and requirements for hearings and requirements for the public other than just those folks to be in it. And to get with my group over here, Leslie Gilbert, Margaret, and these other ladies here that work and advise us, get with them and see if we can't have a second look at it before we hit the floor with it and go to Rules Committee.
And Mr. Hall, to your point, obviously authorization is a different process than appropriations. What we are setting the optimal level for the spending, but of course the appropriators will then have to step in and make the decisions that they make in their committee. Relative to historical times, and that's why I took the time to lay out how much our investment has been throughout the course of the last 25 years in this country to coal and to nuclear. It is big compared to what we've done historically, but compared to the amount of opportunity for solar energy with today's technology, this amount is actually relatively small. So, of course, I'm always interested in working with you and members of the committee to make this bill better. The manager's amendment, as I said earlier, the majority came from, the changes came from the minority members, and minority members brought some great amendments today. I will continue to look forward with you, but I don't want to lose sight of this opportunity, and I want this committee to think big. And the opportunities are great for our country, and putting this roadmap in place will be an excellent tool for us to be able to focus our efforts.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you.
Is there further discussion on the bill? If Mr. Inglis.
Just briefly, I want to associate myself with the comments of the ranking member. I think that he speaks for many of us in saying that this is a good bill that we'd like to be for. It's just the money is beyond a level that is probably going to be appropriated. In fact, not probably, it is beyond the level that's going to be appropriated. In fact, substantially beyond what's going to be appropriated. And so it just it calls into question why we authorize such a large number and then appropriations going to come way below that. But meanwhile, we went way out there on a very large number, especially with the money in the stimulus bill and with the other expenditures. I think it does make sense to spend that money, a lot of money on solar. It is, and I would I disagree with Mr. Brown's comments. Even when a government is in deficit, you would spend money if you're going to make money. And if you've got a company that's in financial trouble, you can go borrow money even though you're in big trouble if they think you've got a great idea. You can find lenders who will lend you money to power your way out of your trouble. And that's the situation that the country's in, I think, as to energy. It makes sense to spend money on energy. The question is whether it makes sense to spend this much money or to authorize this much money. Now, of course, as the ranking member said, we could just all take solace in the fact that, well, it's not going to be appropriated, so just vote for the thing and then just wait for how much the appropriators knock it down to. But that gives us a little bit of a feeling of having authorized a huge number when it's not going to be appropriated.
Mr. Inglis, if I may, I just want to again remind everyone that in fiscal year 2011, the solar roadmap calls for $350 million, which is only 10% of today's energy R&D budget. So it is a number, but in the big picture, it's only 20%. And look at the potential that solar energy has for the nation. So I want to make sure that you keep that number in perspective. Thank you.
Would the gentleman yield?
Would
the gentleman yield?
Happy to yield. Yes, yield.
Well, I'd like to throw in a couple of things. It goes up by $50 million a year, first thing. Secondly, I don't think that solar research has to be necessarily funded by the federal government, particularly when the federal government is in such great debt. It's important for us to be fiscally responsible and just continue to spend money and spend money and spend money that we do not have even to authorize the money at these huge levels that we do not have. I, for one, believe that if we are not energy independent as a nation, we're not a secure nation. So I agree with Ms. Gifford on that, and I'd like to see us energy independent. I'd like to see us develop wind and solar and all these alternative energy sources. I'd like to see us have greater development and easier permitting for nuclear power, and I've been a very strong advocate for doing so. I'd like to see new energy sources developed, and I'm a strong advocate for all of those things. It's just that I think authorizing a much less amount of money than what we're authorizing in the bill as it currently is written is being more fiscally responsible. It doesn't preclude the private sector from spending whatever they want to spend. And I think we've seen breakthroughs in many areas of science and technology across the spectrum that have come from the private sector. Certainly in my business of healthcare and medicine, we've seen the private sector develop lots of things. For instance, LASIK surgery was never funded by the federal government, and the price has been lowered because of the marketplace, just as a good example. So just because we do or don't authorize the amount of money doesn't make the appropriators appropriate it. They could appropriate more than we authorize, and we've seen that in numerous cases too. But I think it's just incumbent upon us as representatives, not rulers of the people that are in our district, but representatives of the people in our district and representatives of our children and grandchildren's future, that we need to cut down the amount of money that's being authorized in this bill. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. If there's no further
Mr. Chairman?
Dr. Bartlett's recognized.
Thank you very much. You know, if oil was still $150 a barrel, we wouldn't be here today talking about funding in this bill. Because when oil was $150 a barrel, industry is spending plenty of money on alternatives. The problem is that the government did not do the responsible thing, and that is to put a floor under oil. We needed to have told industry that oil will never be less than, say, $80 a barrel, which I think is a reasonable figure where industry will now invest in alternatives. We didn't do that. And so now that oil has plummeted down to $60, now $70 a barrel, there just isn't a lot of private capital out there. I wish we had done the other rather than fund each of these individual bills, because we need to put no public money in this. If oil was $150 a barrel now, there was plenty of incentive for the private sector to invest money in it. But the government, we in Congress, did not do the responsible thing, and that is putting a floor, in effect, a floor under oil. Tell industry, if it ever drops below a certain value, I'm not sure what that value is, but if it ever drops below a certain value, we'll make up the difference so you can continue to invest in alternatives, because there's going to be a future in alternatives. We didn't do that, and now we're stuck, so here we are. And I'm not sure this is too much money to spend. We face a huge, huge crisis in energy. You don't see it now because the world is in recession. But the sad fact is that never, ever again can the world have sustained good times unless we do something about alternative energy. Because as soon as the economy comes back worldwide, the demand for oil will go up. It will be $150, $200, $250 a barrel, and that will squelch the economy. So because we didn't do the right thing, now we have to do something which many of my members on my side think is the wrong thing to do. But, here we are. We're kind of stuck, and we really do need this alternative energy. Thank you, and I yield back.
Just quickly. Thank you, Dr. Bartlett. And Mr. Tonko is recognized.
Yeah, just quickly, Mr. Chair. I want to commend the sponsor for her legislation. We're challenging each other at this on the committee, and rightfully so, and there are choices that we're acknowledging need to be made. The real choice is, are we going to commit our nation to compete with other emerging energy powers in the world? That is so obvious right now. If we do not commit to winning this green energy race like we did 40 years ago with the space race, we're going to fall behind. We can talk about a safe, secure, sustainable future for our children. That doesn't happen unless we provide the sort of green energy outcomes that are, fueling the innovation economy in this nation. We must emerge from this race as the go-to nation that will be the exporter of energy, intellect, energy innovation. The government has a role to play in that. We have to shave the priciness off of some of the renewables. We have to commit to the most efficient use of dollars in these sciences and technologies that are developed for renewable opportunities. And so I commend the sponsor, and I think it deserves a supportive vote here.
If there's no further discussion on the bill, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. No. The noes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The clerk will call the roll, please. Record the vote.
Chairman Gordon.
No.
Chairman Gordon votes no. Mr. Costello. Ms. Johnson. Ms. Woolsey.
I don't think we need to bother our people to call.
Mr. Wu.
Here. Just tell them.
Mr. Baird.
Yeah.
Mr. Miller. Mr. Lipinski. Mr. Lipinski votes no. Ms. Giffords. Ms. Giffords votes no. Ms. Edwards. Ms. Fudge. Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes no. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Rothman.
Okay.
Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis votes no. Mr. Chandler. Mr. Chandler votes no. Mr. Carnahan. Mr. Carnahan votes no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill votes no. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell votes no. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes no. Mrs. Dahlkemper. Mr. Grayson. Mr. Grayson votes no. Ms. Comas. Ms. Comas votes no. Mr. Peters.
She just has it.
Mr. Hall.
Aye.
Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner.
Yeah.
Mr. Lamar Smith. Mr. Roybacher.
Yep.
Mr. Roybacher votes aye. Mr. Bartlett.
Present.
Mr. Bartlett votes present. Mr. Ehlers. Mr. Lucas. Mrs. Biggert. Mrs. Biggert votes aye. Mr. Aiken. Mr. Nagelbauer. Mr. Inglis. Mr. Inglis votes aye. Mr. McCall. Mr. McCall votes no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Adrian Smith. Mr. Adrian Smith votes aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown votes aye. Mr. Olson.
That's it. We're going to build up. How is Mr. Baird recorded?
Mr. Baird's not recorded. Mr. Baird votes no.
And how is Mr. Costello reported?
Mr. Costello's not recorded. Mr. Costello votes no.
Is there anyone else that has not been recorded? If not, when the tally is made, please report.
Mr. Chairman, 6 members vote aye, 19 members vote no, and 1 member vote present.
The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there other amendments? If no, then the vote is on the bill. H.R. 3585 as amended. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. I now recognize, Mr. Tonko for a motion.
Mr. Chair, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 3585 as amended to the House with the recommendation that the bill do pass. Furthermore, I move that staff be instructed to prepare the legislative report and make necessary technical and conforming changes, and that the chair take all necessary steps to bring the bill before the House for consideration.
The question is on the motion to report the bill favorably. Those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The bill is favorably reported. Without objection, the motion is reconsidered. Is laid upon the table. Members will have 2 subsequent calendar days in which to submit supplemental, minority, or additional views on the measure. We will now consider H.R. 3598, the Energy and Water Research Integration Act. I recognize myself for 5 minutes to describe the bill. The country faces immense challenges with increased demand on our energy and water resources. H.R. 3598 will provide us with new tools to meet specific technical challenges occurring at the nexus of energy and water. The bill requires the Secretary to consider water-related issues in the Department's existing energy efficiency and energy technology research programs. It does not create a new program at the DOE. Additionally, H.R. 3598 creates an Energy Water Architecture Council that will facilitate the collaboration of industry, academia, and the federal government in improving energy and water resources, data collection, reporting, and technological innovation. This legislation is the product of recommendations from 5 committee hearings on water, several reports from the National Academies, the Government Accounting Office, the National Science Technology Council, and the Department of Energy. I encourage my colleagues on the committee to join me in this effort and support H.R. 9598. I now recognize Mr. Hall to present any remarks to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we agree with you that the energy-water interaction is a very important issue that needs to be taken into consideration and addressed by the DOE and other relevant agents. And we believe your bill is a very good starting point. However, we think there's certain parts of the bill that we find to be potentially overly burdensome to DOE and could do more harm than good. In particular, the bill as it's currently written and as it's written in the manager's amendment would place an additional energy water requirement on every energy research, development, and demonstration program and project of the Department of Energy. This could include the gamut of programs from fossil energy to ARPA-E to EERE, to name just a few. We remind, ourselves that we're always concerned that moving forward with such requirements prior to gathering the proper background data and information, such as a comprehensive assessment of which programs and projects will be affected, may lead to negative unintended consequences. We suggest language that would give the Secretary discretion as to which programs and projects would be affected, but that was unfortunately not accepted. As well, we feel that the Council is unnecessary as it's duplicative of other groups currently in existence. The worst possible scenario is us setting up a situation in which we have different groups developing parallel standards and data collection methods for the energy-water interaction may be very difficult to combine. Such a task would involve some level of data manipulation, which could very well lead to a loss of scientific integrity of the findings. Mr. Chairman, we've worked very hard in this committee to avoid duplicative efforts exactly like this. I believe streamlining and organization is one of the main
motivations for the National Water Research and Development Initiative Act that was passed on the floor earlier this year. I have an amendment to this bill that could address our concerns while incorporating the intent of your bill, Mr. Chairman. As well, we'll have other amendments from our side that we hope you'll consider and accept as an improvement to your bill. And with that, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Does anyone else wish to be recognized? Then I ask unanimous consent that the bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any point, and that the members proceed with amendments in the order of the roster. Without objection, so ordered. The first amendment on the roster is the manager's amendment offered by the chair. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3598, amendment number 005, offered by Mr. Gordon of Tennessee.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize myself for 5 minutes to explain the amendment. The manager's amendment makes a series of changes throughout H.R. 3598 that are the result of good suggestions put forward by the minority staff, and we thank you for those insightful comments. Section 2 of H.R. 3598 is amended to ensure that the Secretary of Energy minimizes wasteful spending of taxpayer dollars by collaborating and coordinating with other agencies and within the programs of the Department to avoid duplication of research efforts. The amendment makes certain that the Secretary shall not unnecessarily delay or disrupt programs or projects at the Department. The amendment also includes a requirement that the Secretary report the findings and activities of the research back to Congress not later than 1 year after the date of enactment. Some areas of specific technology considerations were clarified, including technology development of carbon capture and storage, the technologies that will mitigate impacts on water from energy resource development. This amendment strengthens the bill and adds the oversight necessary to ensure that the Department addresses the critical connection between energy and water. We thank the minority for more than 20 suggestions that we have included in this amendment and in the underlying bill. I ask my colleagues to support this amendment. Is there further discussion on this amendment? Mr. Hall is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank you and your staff for your willingness to work with us on your new bill. You did do that, and while I'm pleased with, and also thank you for the changes that were made, I'm a little disappointed that we couldn't work out. I'd like to have all of the changes we asked for, but a little hoping we could work out a few more. In particular, one suggestion was made to add the words, as you remember, as appropriate to the end of Section 2's in general statement. We felt that this was necessary in order to make clear that this bill is not intended to apply to every energy research, development, demonstration program of the Department of Energy as it now reads. We feel that the Secretary should have more discretion when applying this bill to current and future RD&D programs. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. Just to, again, to point out, the minority received, I think it was in March, the sort of an outline for this bill. I think in 3 weeks ago received the bill, and we've gone through a subcommittee markup on it. Your amendment we did not receive until I think 4:30 last night, and so I think so we did not have time to fully digest it. As the day has gone along, I think it's fair to say that the minority-majority staff have been able to see that we're in sync on many areas, and that we want to continue to work with you to try to clarify that language that we both agree upon. And I think, again, you had some suggestions. We just not have had time to digest them. But as the day has gone along, it appears that we do have much area.
I appreciate it. And I worked on that sucker all day yesterday. Morning this morning about 4:15. Brought it over here and hand carried it to you.
Well, thank you for your promptness. If there's no more discussion, then the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The second amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the ranking member, Mr. Hall. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
I am. Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to ask.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3598, amendment number 016, offered by Mr. Hall of Texas.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. And I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Probably won't take the 5 minutes. I'm actually not going to offer my amendment since we really haven't had a chance to discuss the idea before now, and I understand that. However, I'd like the opportunity to speak on it just a minute, or to give you the general idea, and then request that we work together to address the concerns which my amendment attempts to alleviate, and we'll have some time to do that. As I said earlier, the energy-water interaction is a very important issue. It needs to be taken into consideration and addressed by the DOE and other relevant agencies. Our goal with this amendment was to improve upon your bill by giving the Secretary a little more guidance, a little more discretion, and maybe a little more direction on how to carry out this necessary research. Like Mrs. Gifford's solar technology roadmap bill, we would start with a roadmap and then use its recommendations to help guide RD&D. This amendment would direct the Secretary to develop an energy, water, research, and development roadmap to define research, development, demonstration, and commercialization efforts at DOE. The roadmap would follow the same guidelines laid out in the Chairman's bill and generally take into account the same specific considerations that are incorporated in the Chairman's bill. Additionally, the Secretary would have to lay out technical milestones for each of the considerations listed in the bill. Amendment also includes mutually agreed upon language that was included in the Chairman's manager's amendment on collaboration, utilization of information, and reporting requirements. After receiving the roadmap, the Secretary is then required to implement the findings into a way that would deliver the most, bang for the buck by directing RD&D to those programs at DOE that are identified as the most energy and water intensive and that have the most potential to lessen freshwater withdrawal, increase water use efficiency, and utilize non-traditional water sources. We understand that the DOA has been required to submit a similar report to Congress under previous legislation. There are currently available reports from the Subcommittee on Water Availability and Quality and the National Academies of Science on the issue. We do not see this roadmap language as intended to replace any work that has previously been done or to ignore the work that could be forthcoming, but instead intend for the roadmap in this amendment to be an authoritative document that can serve as a one-stop shop for the energy-water nexus research needs, which incorporates these different reports. And to that end, the timelines set forth by the roadmap in this amendment would not delay implementation of the RD&D, as it mirrors the Chairman's language, which starts in FY 2011. And the roadmap is to be developed some 6 months of enactment. This amendment would also cut the 5-year authorization from $60 million a year for 5 years to $30 million a year for 5 years. The electric power industry released a report 2 years ago that proposes a research and development program on the water energy nexus that would cost $3.75 million a year for 10 years. The R&D program proposed would address at least three of the special considerations outlined in the Chairman's bill and in my amendment. I realize that the electric power industry is not the only energy sector that's affected, so a comprehensive R&D program would be more costly for everyone than what this industry report calls for. Furthermore, I understand that the Chairman's intent may be to establish a program that's more aggressive than industry may propose on its very own. Even with all these considerations, the authorization level included in my amendment is an order of magnitude much greater than the industry report. If the roadmap is done correctly and there truly is collaboration and cooperation within the department and between federal agencies, a funding level of $30 million per year should be more than sufficient to address the needs of this bill. And I yield back unless somebody wants a second reading of this.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. As I mentioned earlier, the manager's amendment included 20 good suggestions from the minority. I think that we are in sync on much of what you're talking about here. We just have not had the time to go through it. And as always, we will continue to work with you to perfect and improve this bill. Thanks. So does the gentleman wish to withdraw the amendment?
I guess so.
Our third amendment on the roster is the amendment offered by the gentlelady from Pennsylvania. Ms. Dahlkemper, are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, I am, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3598, amendment number 003, offered by Ms. Dahlkemper of Pennsylvania.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentlelady for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Chairman Gordon, Ranking Member Hall, and fellow members. H.R. 3598, the Energy and Water Research Integration Act, is a very timely bill which takes strong steps to see that we make better use of both our energy resources and our water resources. It does so by coordinating our efforts to consider the use of water when we produce energy, as well as the energy demands of supplying water. I applaud Chairman Gordon for his leadership in this important initiative and once again dealing with the important and challenging topic of water resource planning. I believe conservation of water and energy are complementary components of any plan to ensure that both are available in adequate supply to our nation's households and businesses. Clearly, we cannot afford to waste either. My amendment requests the Secretary of Energy, when carrying out energy research, development, and demonstration projects, to consider increases in energy efficiency of water distribution and collection systems, and to consider technologies for energy generation from water distribution and collection systems as appropriate. Thank you, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Dahlkemper. More importantly, thank you for, this is a very good amendment to this bill, and we're killing two birds with one stone. Thank you. Does anyone else wish to be recognized? If there's no further,
Chairman,
Mr. Hall is recognized.
No, thank you. I commend my colleague on her work on this bill. However, I'm not certain I'm interpreting the gentlelady's amendment correctly, and I may have a question so to ask. The first provision would increase the energy efficiency of water distribution and collection systems. Beg your pardon?
Excuse me. No worries.
And was my time up?
No, sir.
I'll ask you this question. Does this mean that the Department of Energy is meant to do R&D on water distribution and collection systems?
It means that they're going to look at this as one of the parameters that's going to be considered as this goes forward when they are incorporated as appropriate for the project.
And do you feel that this is within their purview?
Yes, I do.
Are they currently doing any R&D in this area, if you know?
I'm not exactly sure what they're doing in this area. I'm just saying that it needs to be something they look at as they go forward.
I think that's reasonable, and I thank you for that. The second provision would require the Secretary to consider technologies for energy generation from water distribution and collection systems. The way I'm reading it, it sounds like you're describing putting turbines into the sewage system and getting energy out of it. Is this correct? Is that correct?
I think that's one of the new technologies that could be looked at, and that's why I'm saying it should be considered, that we might allow water systems to actually generate renewable electricity from normal water and wastewater pipelines.
What are the implications you ran into putting turbines inside highly pressurized enclosed pipe systems? I know you did a study or had a study done on it.
I had a study done.
Someone did to give you the information to write the bill from.
Well,
we line people up in those chairs out there, you know.
Sure. Well, I know that there is an application being used on an inline turbine that generated energy from hydropower, moving water. And this is the type, I think, of innovation.
Would staff like to add some additional information to this? Question?
Could you just clarify, are you asking about what company is already doing this?
No, just what problems are putting turbines? It seems to me to be
terrific
problems inside those highly pressurized enclosed pipe systems.
That's exactly why the research is needed to look at this technology and see what is going to be the effects of it.
That's a good answer.
Would the gentleman yield?
About as good an answer as I, sure.
Would the gentleman yield?
I don't want to, but I will.
Okay, thank you. I would just like to ask if this sewage is in the pipes under pressure because it's being pumped.
The company that this technology is being looked at, the company right now that is looking at this technology both pumps wastewater as well as other kinds of water. So right now they're looking to see what would be the impacts of that.
If this water is running downhill, you'll get some energy from it. If you're putting this in a pipe that is being pressurized by a pump, you ain't going to get no energy, because whatever, you'll lose energy, because the energy you'll get from that is going to be less than the energy. This is the second law of thermodynamics, which you will not violate. So unless this stuff is running downhill, you're not going to get any energy from this. Just putting it in a pressurized pipe that's being pumped by a pump, you're going to have to put a whole lot bigger pump on the other end, which is going to consume more energy than you're going to get out of your little turbine in the flow. Am I wrong?
I don't believe so, not in that example, no.
Then you can only use sewage just running downhill. Is that my understanding?
That is why the research is needed, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Do I still have the time?
Yes, sir, Mr. Hall.
I don't know how we could hardly make it run uphill. Would the gentlelady be amenable to one thing? That's providing a little further clarification in report language. You'll have a chance to do that, and we all get help on getting.
I'd be glad to. I just think we need to study, where we have a potential resource.
Ensure that others don't misinterpret.
We haven't well evaluated this, and that's what the purpose of this is, to evaluate this, to really see if there is a potential.
I think that would help my questions on it, and I appreciate it, and I thank you. I yield back.
Is there further discussion on the amendment? If no, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed upon. I understand that, Mr. Smith, you're going to combine Amendment 4 and 5.
With unanimous consent, I do request that they be considered en bloc.
Without objection, the clerk will report the amendments.
Mr. Chairman, these are en bloc amendments by Mr. Smith of Nebraska on amendment on H.R. 3598, amendment number 006 and 007.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to make this quick. These amendments I'm offering today are very straightforward clarifications. One clarifies the bill should not be the basis for any new federal regulations regarding state, local, or tribal use of water. The other states this bill shall not be used to increase the financial burden on state, local, and tribal governments by restricting their water use. The purpose of this legislation is to ensure water and energy usage are considered in existing DOE research programs and support research furthering the continued availability of both water and energy. These are certainly laudable goals. Unfortunately, the bill makes 3 references which could be construed to lead to more regulations. 1, the modeling of issues relating to energy required to provide water supplies. Another, the interagency collaboration section, which may impact the Bureau of Reclamation and its customers. And the third one, the Energy Water Architecture Council, which is charged with developing data collection standards and protocols for the energy required to provide water supplies. My amendments ensure the legislation accomplishes only its stated intent and cannot be read to restrict the use of water or energy by state and local governments. Any regulatory reading could contradict the existing jurisdiction and oversight of local stakeholders. As a representative of a district which leads in 2 water energy-intensive industries, agriculture and biofuels, and where water quantity is problematic, I'm very sensitive to these issues. I appreciate the chairman and my fellow committee members for sharing those concerns, and believe if the intent of this bill is to simply improve data collection, then certainly there should be no concern with this amendment. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Smith, it's my understanding that our staffs have collaborated and that that there is maybe some language tweaking that needs to be done, and if you're in agreement with that, then we would gladly accept your amendments.
Thank you very much.
If there is no further discussion, Mr. Hall is recognized.
No, I have no further questions.
Then the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The 6th amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Johnson. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3598 offered by Ms. Eddie Bernice Johnson of Texas, amendment number 087.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentlelady for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for considering this amendment. The amendment to H.R. 3598 addresses a section called Specific Considerations. This part of the bill provides specific items for the research program that the Secretary of Energy should consider supporting. For example, new advanced cooling technologies for energy generation are listed. Technologies that are life cycle cost effective are also listed. My amendment would state that a specific consideration should also include technologies to treat and utilize produced waters discharged from oil, natural gas, coal bed methane, and mining activities. Texas is a state that's rich in natural gas resources, and I would like to ensure that research supported by this program would also include water that may be used during the exploration and mining for natural gas. As you know, I chair the subcommittee on water, resource, and environment on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and research on water and energy production is an issue focus of mine. I'm glad to see that this committee's interest in energy and water, and I believe that H.R. 3598 will enable the Department of Energy to support some vital areas of research. Again, my amendment would only add that an additional consideration, which will include technologies to utilize produced waters that are discharged from natural gas mining activities. And I want to thank Chairman Gordon and Ranking Member Hall for considering my amendment. I urge its passage and yield back the balance of my time.
Is there further discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman, we think it's a good amendment. We support it.
If there's no further discussion on the amendment, then the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Okay. If Mr. Brown is prepared, we're going to temporarily skip over Amendment 7 and go to Amendment 8.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment in the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3598, offered by Mr. Brown of Georgia, amendment number 142.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the time and consideration of my amendment. In my home district, I like to say we have three main issues: water, water, and water.
Oh, you mean they're not there?
Up until the recent flooding that Georgia experienced, my home state and most of the southeast was experiencing what most people would kindly call a prolonged drought. In fact, some even call it a century-long drought. The Savannah River, which runs all along the eastern border of my district in the state of Georgia, is not only a key economic driver for the region, as the chairman can attest, but is the linchpin around which entire cities are based. And I know that Georgia is not alone in our constant struggle with the usage and protection of our water resources. Just about every state from Florida to California and Arizona to Maine has dealt and is dealing with their very own local and regional water issues. It is because water's vital and ever-increasing role in our country, including in our energy production, which is what this legislation is designed to address, I'm asking the committee to incorporate my amendment. Earlier this year, this Congress passed the Omnibus Public Land Management Act. Among the many provisions and protections included in this legislation was the National Water Availability and Use Assessment Program. This program tasked the United States Geological Survey with assessing the availability and use of the nation's water resources. This study would help us gain a clearer understanding of the status of our water resources and the land use, water use, and natural climatic trends that affect them. The goal of this program is to improve our ability to forecast water availability for future economic and environmental uses. Simply put, the assessment will help characterize how much water we have now, how water availability is changing, and how much water we can expect to have in the future. The amendment that I've offered would delay the implementation of Section 2 of the underlying bill until the USGA has completed their study and reported back to Congress their findings. The findings to be brought forward in this study will give the Secretary of Energy well-defined, narrowly focused template to carry out Section 2 of H.R. 3598. Mr. Chairman, I strongly believe that water is one of our greatest resources, and we should do all that we can to utilize it when possible, but guard against waste and abuse at all times. It is my hope that the pending USGA study will set out a pathway to help us accomplish those goals. And my amendment asks this committee to delay any new water-based energy research and development studies until this report has been submitted to Congress. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. Are there other members on our side that wish to be recognized? If not, I'll recognize myself briefly for a response on behalf of Chairman Gordon. The gentleman's point is important. Certainly, we need to understand the availability of various water resources, and there are studies underway. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to wait for those studies before we can move forward with this legislation. There is ample information now about volumes of water that are available. There's an urgent need because just some of the numbers of some of the major energy projects, whether certain solar projects or carbon sequestration, et cetera, we need, I think, to move this legislation forward rather than waiting because we're using that water right now, and the more we wait, the more water is getting used, and I think we can move forward with both. So I would respectfully urge defeat of this amendment. Mr. Hall looks like he has something to offer, and I'll recognize Mr. Hall for 5 minutes.
I agree with the chairman. I yield back.
Are there others wishing to comment on this? If no, the vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor will say aye. Those opposed, no. No. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it. Which one are we on?
Going back to the 7th to hit bigger.
Well, we moved back and moved past. So we're now, which one are we on, the 7th? We're on 7th. We'll go back to the 7th amendment now on the roster, an amendment offered by the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Biggert. Ms. Biggert, are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, I am. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment, please.
Amendment to H.R. 3598, offered by Mrs. Biggert of Illinois, amendment number 009.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentlelady for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would strike the Energy Water Architecture Council in Section 3 of this bill. While the concept is a laudable goal, it seems to me that it duplicates work done by other federal departments, agencies, and the private sector. The other bodies were created under prior statutes, including the Secure Water Act, and are working on these issues, and DOE already participates in such group efforts. In fact, we found over 30 groups involved in water research ranging from state, regional, and privately coordinated entities. The need for a new council isn't necessary when the infrastructure already exists. Section 2C of the text specifically calls for interagency collaboration at the direction of the Secretary. I think that serves as a better foundation from which the same goals could be achieved, but without the extra layer of bureaucracy. I support your efforts to better coordinate and plan for water use and availability in the energy sector through H.R. 3598, but I'm not sure that another energy water research group is the best use of the scarce research dollars that we have. And I would urge support for my amendment and yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Are there members on our side wishing to comment? If not, I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Ms. Biggert, I appreciate the concern about duplication of effort. I think it's something we all share. However, in hearings on this topic, we heard from a number of agencies and witnesses suggesting that the precise function of this bill, in this section of the bill, looking at this nexus between energy and water, is not duplicated and currently by other agencies or other studies to our knowledge, and vis-a-vis that nexus per se. And as such, while the general principle of trying to avoid duplication makes sense, we don't believe that's applicable in this particular case, and hence, with regret, I would urge defeat of the amendment. Mr. Hall, I think, had wanted to clarify his position on the prior amendment. Mr. Brown, you'll want to. I apparently had baffled my colleague with my eloquent rhetoric, and he believed he was supporting something he wasn't supporting. So I'll give him a chance to clarify.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if I ought to move to reconsider the vote by which the vote was taken, and then support to Dr. Brown. You bragged on him up to the last 3 words.
That was my strategy.
And I didn't know.
I learned it from a Texan.
I wasn't properly listening. I support Dr. Brown on this and almost any amendment he has. And I thank you for your fairness. Thank you.
Mr. Brown,
Mr. Chairman, I just, Mr. Hall and I have the utmost respect for Mr. Hall, and he and I are never going to have any problems. Even if we disagree on something, we'll be I'll still have respect for him, and I appreciate him bringing that forward and clarifying that.
In this case, he agreed with you.
Yes, he did. So, but thank you, Mr. Hall, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, would you yield?
I actually think Mr. Hall has the time, so he would yield to you, but he also wants to speak to this amendment as well. So Mr. Hall controls the time here.
Mr. Chairman, I think this amendment will remove the Energy Water Architecture Council from the bill. And this council is redundant of other groups from doing the same work in developing standards and data collection methods. This type of duplication is what this committee has been trying to eliminate in almost every bill we move through here. Keeping the council in the bill would contradict almost everything we've been working so hard to avoid. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment to strike this section, and I yield to Mrs. Vickers.
Biggert, yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member Hall. I would just like to actually ask unanimous consent to submit for the record the existing water research programs, of which is 3 pages with the 30 that I talked about.
Without objection.
Thank you.
I yield back my time.
Thank you. Are there any others wishing to? Are there any others wishing to comment on the amendment? If no, the vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it. Are there any other amendments? If no, then the vote occurs on the bill.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Bilbray, it sounds like.
While the chairman isn't here, I figure I'd compliment him for.
Would someone get the chairman?
I don't want us to go by this bill without pointing out that one of the things this bill does well, it ties energy and water supply together. Too often they're divided. And I just hope those of us that always talk about water remember that we always talk about the liquid stuff, but in reality, if we're going to have safe drinking water, it's more important to have clean, cost-effective electricity than to have fresh water available, in a natural form. The fact is, if you do not have clean, inexpensive electricity, you can't either transport that water that you have, or you can't create it locally. And so this nexus of tying the two together is absolutely essential. And I hope to see that this comes out, and we talk about the way we can use different technologies. But a great example is the fact that in San Diego, we're pumping massive amounts of water from 500 miles away. Though we have just now rebuilt our nuclear power plants at San Onofre, nobody even thinks about why we don't go to peak production with a zero-emission technology like nuclear. We're on off, because they said, well, what are you going to do with the power with off-peak? What we could do is desalination and eliminate all of the impact of pumping and transporting and digging the canals. But no one's taken the two and sticking them together. And I think this technology can do that. This technology can go beyond that and look at things like the fact of why are we using fresh water to sequester and carbon imprints when we got the algae technology that can grow in salt water and be able to sequester the emissions from our power plants or from other locations. So by putting these two things together, I think is really a great step. And I hope every time somebody in this committee talks about water, we always remember, but where is going to be the clean, inexpensive electricity to be able to pump the water or create the water? And I think this committee will help do it. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Point well taken, and of course the bill works in the opposite direction as well. As we look for alternative energy sources, we need to look at the water impacts of those sources, and so I think the gentleman's points are well taken. Any other comments? If not, then the where was it? It actually had the vote? Yeah, I thought we did. The vote occurs on the bill, H.R. 3598, as amended. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. I recognize Mr. Tonko to offer a motion.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 3598 as amended to the House with the recommendation that the bill do pass. Furthermore, I move that staff be instructed to prepare the legislative report and make necessary technical and conforming changes, and that the chair take all necessary steps to bring the bill before the House for consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Tonko. The question is now on the motion to report the bill favorably. Those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Members will have 2 subsequent calendar days in which to submit supplemental, minority, or additional views on the measure. I want to thank the members for their attendance and the staff on both sides for their good work. This concludes our committee markup.